The fire crackles softly. Welcome back, friends. Tonight, Rome's fifth king. An outsider. An Etruscan merchant with Roman ambitions and a fortune large enough to make those ambitions dangerous. His name was Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. And he would change Rome in ways the previous four kings never imagined. Let the fire's warmth settle around you. Let your breathing slow. The story begins now. Lucumo was born in Tarquinia with two significant problems. First, his father was Greek, a refugee named Demaratus, who'd fled Corinth during political upheaval and settled in the Etruscan city with enough wealth to buy respectability, but not quite enough to buy acceptance. Greek ancestry in an Etruscan city meant you were foreign, other, perpetually outside the circles that mattered, regardless of how much money you had or how well you spoke Etruscan, or how many times you contributed to temple renovations. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Lucumo was ambitious in ways that made people uncomfortable. Not the comfortable ambition of wanting to be successful within your station. Not the acceptable desire to be wealthy or respected within appropriate boundaries, but the uncomfortable ambition of wanting to be more than your birth allowed. Of looking at social hierarchies and thinking, those are suggestions, not limits. Of possessing the particular combination of capability and hunger that makes established powers nervous. Tarquinia. Beautiful, sophisticated, ancient Tarquinia was not interested in Lucumo's ambitions. The Etruscan cities were old and organized, and had very specific ideas about who belonged where. Your birth determined your possibilities. Greek ancestry meant certain doors stayed closed regardless of wealth or talent, or how successfully you played by every other rule. The aristocratic families who controlled Tarquinian politics had held power for generations, and intended to continue holding it, thank you very much, without accommodation for ambitious half-Greeks with uncomfortable amounts of capability. You could be successful here. One Tarquinian elder told Lucumo during a conversation about political office, that Lucumo was politely but firmly being told he'd never hold. Wealthy, respected within appropriate contexts, but magistrate, tribune, positions of actual authority. Those require proper lineage, which you, unfortunately, lack. My father brought significant wealth to Tarquinia, Lucumo pointed out. Established trade connections with Greek cities, contributed to temples. My family has served this city for 2 generations, and we appreciate that service. The elder said with the particular tone that meant appreciation without acceptance. But service and eligibility are different things. Your family serves Tarquinia well. That doesn't make you Tarquinian in the ways that matter for public office. We have very specific definitions of Tarquinian, you understand. And unfortunately for you, they were written by people who weren't your ancestors. It was said kindly, apologetically even, with the sort of sympathetic regret that didn't change anything, but made the person saying it feel better about not changing anything. But it was absolute. Lucumo left that conversation understanding several things simultaneously. He would never hold power in Tarquinia. He was capable of holding power somewhere. Staying in a place that would never let him become what he could be was a choice, not an inevitability, and also that Tarquinian aristocracy were very polite about telling you to accept your limitations and stop being difficult about bloodlines. He went home to his wife and said, "We're leaving." Tanaquil was not surprised. She'd married Lucumo, knowing exactly what kind of man he was. Ambitious, capable, aware of his own potential, frustrated by artificial limitations, prone to staring at walls while thinking about power structures and how to circumvent them. She'd also married him knowing what kind of woman she was, even more ambitious than her husband, possibly more capable, definitely more willing to pursue power through unconventional means, including prophecy, augury, and the strategic interpretation of omens in ways that consistently supported desired outcomes. "Where are we going?" she asked practically. Not, "Are we leaving, or should we reconsider?" Just the immediate practical question of destination, because she'd seen this coming for months, and had probably already started mentally packing. "Rome," Lucumo said. Tanaquil considered this. Rome, the Latin city to the south. Younger than Tarquinia by centuries, less sophisticated, less cultured, built by shepherds who'd become surprisingly successful at warfare and infrastructure, but remained charmingly unsophisticated about art, religion, and the finer points of civilization. But also, and this was important, less ossified, less concerned with ancient lineages, more willing to accept capable people regardless of origin, or at least that was Rome's reputation among Etruscans who paid attention to such things. Rome had been ruled by a man who talked to goddesses in groves, another who died via lightning bolt for ignoring gods, and most recently someone whose greatest achievement was building a bridge. The bar for impressiveness, Tanaquil calculated, was not impossibly high. Rome just lost its king, Tanaquil said thoughtfully. She paid attention to regional politics, made it her business to know who held power where, and what opportunities might be emerging. Ancus Marcius died recently. They'll be choosing a new king soon. Succession is uncertain. That's the best time to arrive anywhere, when positions haven't solidified yet, and people are still figuring out the new order. "I'm aware," Lucumo said. "You're thinking very ambitiously," Tanaquil observed. "I'm thinking practically," Lucumo corrected. "We could stay in Tarquinia and be wealthy people who were never quite accepted. forever hovering at the edges of power while less capable people hold office because their great-great-grandfathers happen to be the right sort of Etruscan. Or we could go to Rome and see what's actually possible when capability matters more than lineage and people haven't had centuries to calcify into hereditary mediocrity. Rome has its own aristocracy, Tanaquil pointed out, playing devil's advocate, because someone had to. Its own established families, its own ideas about who deserves power. The Julii, the Fabii, various other families, who think they're Rome's natural rulers. Rome is 4 generations old, Lucumo replied. Tarquinia is ancient, there's a difference. Rome's aristocracy remember when their grandfathers were shepherds and their great-grandfathers stole Sabine women because they couldn't convince women to marry them voluntarily. They're less precious about bloodlines because their bloodlines are recent and somewhat embarrassing if examined too closely. That creates opportunity. Also, they're less sophisticated, Tanaquil added. Which means Etruscan culture actually impresses them. We'd be bringing something Rome doesn't have and clearly wants based on how much they keep copying Etruscan religious practices and pretending they invented them. Exactly, Lucumo agreed. We're not supplicants asking for acceptance. We're bringing expertise and sophistication to a city that's powerful but rough. That's a trade, not a plea. Tanaquil smiled. This was why she'd married him. He saw angles, possibilities, the gaps between what was and what could be. Also because he was wealthy and ambitious and she was ambitious and practical. And together they made the kind of partnership that could actually accomplish things rather than just dreaming about them. We'll need to change your name, she said. Lucumo sounds Greek. Too foreign. Romans are suspicious of Greeks. They think all Greeks are clever philosophers who'll trick them with words, which is sometimes accurate but unhelpful for our purposes. What do you suggest? Lucius Tarquinius, Tanaquil said immediately. She'd clearly been thinking about this, possibly for months, definitely since the conversation about leaving had become, when rather than if. Lucius is Latin enough. They have their own Lucii. It sounds familiar. Tarquinius claims Tarquinian heritage without the Greek associations. We present you as Etruscan, sophisticated, cultured, wealthy, not as half-Greek refugee's son with complicated ancestry. Etruscans have status in Rome. Greeks have baggage and accusations of being too clever. Lucius Tarquinius, Lucomo. Now Tarquinius, tested the name. It sounded more Roman. More like someone who could belong somewhere new. More like someone who could hold power without people immediately wondering about foreign complications. It means from Tarquinia. Exactly. Simple. Clear. Not trying to hide your origin. Just framing it favorably. You're Etruscan by culture, which is impressive. The Greek part becomes family history that doesn't need emphasis. And you? You? I stay Tanaquil, she said. Thoroughly Etruscan name. Thoroughly Etruscan heritage. I'm your connection to legitimacy. Your proof that you're properly Etruscan despite wanting to live in Rome. Also, I'm not changing my name because I like my name, and one of us maintaining consistency seems wise. They planned for months. Not rushing, not fleeing like refugees, but deliberately preparing for relocation that would be permanent. They sold property in Tarquinia carefully, converting everything to portable wealth. Gold, silver, fine goods that would impress Romans who were less sophisticated than Etruscans, and therefore easily impressed by Etruscan craftsmanship. It wasn't manipulation if you were genuinely bringing superior culture, Tanaquil reasoned. It was education. Romans would benefit from exposure to proper Etruscan art and architecture. The fact that this exposure would also make Tarquinius and Tanaquil impressively wealthy and sophisticated in Roman eyes was just fortunate coincidence. They studied Rome, its history, its politics, its current power structure, who the important families were, which ones held real power, which ones just thought they did, which ones might be convinced to support an ambitious Etruscan with useful connections, what Rome valued, how previous kings had come to power, the gaps in Roman culture that Etruscan expertise could fill. Rome has ambitions, Tanaquil observed during their research. Under Tullus they were military conquest, expansion, making neighbours afraid. Under Uncus they were infrastructural bridges, ports, making things work. But they're still unfinished, practical but not beautiful, functional but not impressive. They don't have the kind of cultural sophistication that makes cities important beyond just being powerful. They're shepherds who learned to fight and build, Tarquinius agreed. Impressive shepherds, certainly, but still fundamentally shepherds. They don't have temples like Etruscan cities. Their religious practices are borrowed and modified. Their art is functional. Their architecture is adequate. They're a powerful city that doesn't look powerful, and that bothers them even if they don't quite know how to articulate the problem. So we bring sophistication, Tanaquil said. Etruscan art, architecture, religious practices. The kind of cultural capital that makes Rome feel less like an oversized village, and more like a real Mediterranean power. Something worthy of respect beyond just military strength. And in exchange, Rome gives us what Tarquinia wouldn't. Tarquinius finished. The opportunity to actually be someone, to hold real power, to become what we're capable of becoming, rather than what our birth permits. It was a bargain. Rome got culture and sophistication and expertise it currently lacked. Tarquinius got opportunity and acceptance, and the possibility of power that Tarquinia had permanently denied. Both parties benefited if the arrangement worked. If it didn't work, they'd be foreigners in a strange city with no connections. limited options for return since they'd sold everything in Tarquinia, and the embarrassing need to explain to everyone back home why their ambitious gamble had failed. But risk, they'd decided, was better than certainty of limitation. Better to try and fail than to stay and wonder what might have been possible. Rome will be impressed by Etruscan sophistication. Tarquinius predicted confidently during their final planning. Acceptance will follow naturally once they see what we can offer. He was, as it turned out, only about half right about this. Rome would indeed be impressed by Etruscan sophistication, but naturally and immediately were optimistic. Rome would need convincing, and convincing would require both capability and luck, and possibly some dramatically convenient omens that could be interpreted as divine approval. Fortunately, Tanaquil was excellent at interpreting omens, and luck or something that looked enough like luck was about to arrive. In the spring of what would later be calculated as roughly 616 BCE, Lucius Tarquinius and Tanaquil loaded everything they owned into wagons and left Tarquinia for Rome. They were perhaps 30 years old, wealthy, capable, ambitious, ready to see whether Rome would let them become what they knew they could be, ready to trade Etruscan sophistication for Roman opportunity, ready to discover whether a city 4 generations old was flexible enough to accept outsiders with useful talents, or whether Rome was already developing the same rigid hierarchies that made Tarquinia impossible for anyone born outside the right families. The journey south was uneventful for several days. Good roads. Etruscans built excellent roads. Romans were still learning pleasant weather, the particular anticipation that comes with starting something new that could be either brilliant or catastrophic depending on factors you can control, and factors you definitely cannot. And then, as they approached Rome's territory, the gods, or chance, or Tanaquil's strategic interpretation of natural phenomena, provided exactly the omen they needed. An eagle appeared. An eagle appeared, and what the eagle did next would determine everything. The eagle appeared on the 3rd day of their journey, when they were perhaps 10 miles from Rome, travelling along a road that was becoming noticeably less well-maintained now that they'd left Etruscan territory and entered Latin lands. Tarquinius was driving the lead wagon. Tanaquil sat beside him. Their servants and the rest of their possessions followed in additional wagons behind. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent, the kind of golden light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it actually is. The eagle came from nowhere, or from somewhere high above where no one had been looking, because normal people don't spend their time scanning the sky for symbolic birds while travelling. It circled once, twice, then dove directly at Tarquinius, not attacking. Birds of prey don't typically attack full-grown humans driving wagons. That's not how predator-prey relationships work. But descending with clear purpose, with the kind of directed flight that suggested this wasn't random bird behavior but something more intentional. The eagle swooped low, close enough that Tarquinius could see individual feathers, close enough to feel the displacement of air from its wings, and then, with what appeared to be deliberate precision, it grabbed Tarquinius's cap. The distinctive Etruscan cap he was wearing, made of fine fabric, clearly expensive right off his head. Tarquinius made an undignified noise of surprise. The horses startled slightly. The servants in the wagons behind craned their necks to see what was happening. The eagle climbed with the cap in its talons, circling higher, carrying this expensive piece of Etruscan headwear toward the sky like it had just won a prize. "That's my Tarquinius," started, reaching upward uselessly because the eagle was already 20 feet above them and climbing. "That's an expensive cap. That's why would an eagle want a cap?" "Stop the wagon," Tanaquil said quietly, not panicked, not confused, focused in the particular way she got when she was thinking about something important. "The eagle has my—" "Stop the wagon," Tanaquil repeated, more firmly. Tarquinius stopped the wagon. The servants stopped their wagons behind. Everyone stared upward at the eagle, which was now perhaps 50 feet above them, still holding the cap, circling in patterns that looked almost deliberate. "It's an omen," Tanaquil said. Not questioning, stating, "This is a sign. It's a bird that stole my hat," Tarquinius said. Though he was already reconsidering this interpretation because Tanaquil was rarely wrong about omens, and also because the eagle was doing something very strange now. The eagle stopped circling, hovered for a moment, which eagles can do, barely, though it looks effortful and slightly ridiculous, then descended again, directly at Tarquinius, still carrying the cap. It dropped the cap perfectly back onto Tarquinius's head, not beside him, not near him, directly onto his head, positioned correctly, as if the eagle had been trained in the proper placement of Etruscan headwear. Then it flew away, climbing rapidly, disappearing toward the east without looking back. Complete silence for several seconds. "What?" Tarquinius said carefully. "Just happened?" Tanaquil was smiling. The particular smile she got when she was pleased about something, and also already calculating how to use it. "That was Jupiter." or Jupiter's messenger. Same difference for practical purposes. The king of the gods just took your cap, symbolizing your current status, lifted it to the heavens, symbolizing divine attention and approval, and then returned it to your head, symbolizing that you will receive high office, authority, power through divine sanction. Or, Tarquinius suggested, an eagle saw something shiny and interesting, grabbed it, decided it wasn't food, and dropped it. Birds do that. It's not always divine intervention. It placed the cap back on your head perfectly, Tanaquil pointed out. Precisely positioned. Eagles don't do that. Eagles drop things. They don't carefully replace stolen items with attention to proper alignment. This was intentional. This was a message. From Jupiter. From Jupiter, Tanaquil confirmed. Who is telling Rome that you are meant for kingship? That divine will supports your ambition. That what you're about to attempt isn't hubris, it's destiny. Tarquinius looked at his wife. She was serious. Completely serious. She believed this, or at least she believed that this omen could be presented as believable, which for practical purposes amounted to the same thing. This is very convenient timing, he observed. The gods have excellent timing, Tanaquil replied serenely. That's one of the defining characteristics of gods. They intervene at exactly the right moment to make their messages clear. Would you prefer the omen arrived 3 weeks ago when we were still in Tarquinia, or 3 weeks from now after you'd already failed to gain any Roman attention? This is precisely when an omen should arrive, right before entering Rome, right when divine endorsement would be most useful. She had a point. Several points, actually, and Tarquinius was not so committed to skepticism that he'd reject a useful omen just because it was suspiciously convenient. If the gods wanted to endorse his kingship via theatrical bird behavior, who was he to argue with divine will? So we tell people, Tarquinius said slowly, working through the implications, that on the journey to Rome, Jupiter sent an eagle to bless me with kingship. We tell people exactly what happened, Tanaquil corrected. An eagle removed your cap, took it to the heavens and returned it perfectly to your head. Those are facts, objective observations, multiple witnesses. She gestured at the servants who were all nodding enthusiastically because arguing with your employer's wife about divine omens was not a career-enhancing strategy. And the interpretation? Tarquinius asked. The interpretation is obvious to anyone familiar with augury, Tanaquil said. Eagles are Jupiter's bird. Removing and replacing a cap symbolizes removal and replacement of status. The heavens represent divine approval. This isn't ambiguous symbolism requiring elaborate explanation. This is straightforward divine messaging that even Romans who are not sophisticated about augury will immediately understand. Romans have augurs, Tarquinius pointed out. Official augurs. They might have different interpretations. Romans have augurs who mostly look at chicken behavior and call it prophecy. Tanaquil replied with the disdain of someone from a culture with much more elaborate augury traditions. Etruscan augury is more advanced, more nuanced, better trained. When we arrive in Rome and tell this story, I will interpret it with Etruscan expertise, and Roman augurs will either agree because the interpretation is obviously correct, or they'll disagree and look like they're rejecting a clear divine message, which is politically awkward for them. She'd thought this through. Of course she'd thought this through. Tanaquil thought everything through, preferably several steps ahead of everyone else. This actually happened, Tarquinius said, still somewhat amazed. We didn't plan this. We didn't arrange theatrical bird behavior. An eagle actually grabbed my cap and put it back. The gods work in mysterious ways, Tanaquil said, which was the traditional thing you said when divine intervention was either genuinely mysterious or suspiciously convenient, and you didn't want to examine it too closely. What matters is that it happened, it was witnessed, and it provides exactly the sort of divine endorsement that makes ambitious foreigners acceptable to tradition-minded Romans who might otherwise be suspicious of wealthy Etruscans arriving with political aspirations. The servants were still watching the sky, possibly hoping for additional omens, possibly just confused about whether they should be impressed or concerned. We should continue, Tanaquil said practically. Rome is close. We want to arrive before sunset, make a good first impression, and start telling this story to the right people as soon as possible, while the omen is still fresh and impressive. Tarquinius picked up the reins, adjusted his cap, which the eagle had indeed placed back perfectly. He had to admit that was strange. That was more than just random bird behavior. That suggested either divine intervention or the world's most skilled eagle. They continued toward Rome, and behind them in the wagons, the servants began discussing what they'd just witnessed, each version of the story becoming slightly more elaborate and impressive with each retelling, which was fine, which was actually helpful. because the story needed to spread, and impressive versions spread faster than mundane ones. By the time they reached Rome, the eagle would have been twice as large, the cap would have been lifted to impossible heights, and Jupiter's involvement would be completely unambiguous to anyone who heard the tale, which was exactly what they needed: divine endorsement, witnessed by multiple people, interpretable in only one way. This Etruscan newcomer was blessed by the king of the gods for high office. Rome wouldn't be able to refuse him, not without refusing Jupiter. And Rome, whatever its other characteristics, was not in the habit of refusing Jupiter. Not after what had happened to Tullus Hostilius when he'd gotten too casual about divine respect. The eagle had disappeared toward the east, gone back to wherever eagles went when they weren't delivering conveniently timed omens to ambitious foreigners. But its message remained, clear as the sky, impossible to ignore. Tarquinius was meant for greatness. The gods had said so. Everyone had seen it. And Rome, practical, unsophisticated. Recently kingless Rome was about to meet someone who came with divine credentials and Etruscan sophistication, and the particular kind of confidence that came from knowing the gods approved of your ambitions. This was going to be interesting. Rome appeared on the horizon an hour later. 7 hills covered in buildings, walls encompassing territory that was larger than Tarquinius had expected, more impressive than Etruscan reports had suggested. It wasn't Tarquinia, wasn't as old, as artistically sophisticated, as culturally refined, but it was substantial, real, a city with presence and power, and the kind of organized infrastructure that suggested competent governance, even if that governance lacked Etruscan polish. It's bigger than I thought, Tarquinius admitted. Ancus Marcius expanded it, Tanaquil said. She'd studied Rome's recent history carefully, built the bridge, founded the port at Ostia, integrated conquered populations. The city doubled in size over his reign. This isn't the shepherd village Romulus founded. This is a real Mediterranean power that just doesn't know how to present itself properly. They approached the main gate. Guards stood watch, professional soldiers, not village militia. Organized, alert. The kind of military presence that suggested Rome took security seriously and had the resources to maintain it. State your business, one guard said in Latin. Not hostile, just professional. Just doing his job of asking everyone entering Rome what they wanted. Lucius Tarquinius of Tarquinia, Tarquinius announced, using his new name with the confidence of someone who'd been using it for years rather than months. Etruscan merchant. I'm relocating to Rome with my household. We bring greetings from Tarquinia and hope for residence and eventual citizenship. It was a formal statement. Polite, clear. The kind of thing you said when you wanted to signal that you were wealthy, respectable, and interested in proper procedures, rather than sneaking in and causing problems. The guard looked at the wagons. Multiple wagons. Clearly expensive possessions visible under protective coverings. Well-dressed servants. Everything about the arrival suggested wealth and legitimacy. Etruscan? The guard asked. Not suspicious, just curious. Rome had Etruscan residents, traders, craftsmen, various people who moved between cities, but they weren't common. From Tarquinia. Tarquinius confirmed. My family has traded with Rome previously. We've decided to make residence here permanent. Big decision, the guard observed. Tarquinia to Rome. What brings you? This was the moment. The perfect opportunity. Tarquinius glanced at Tanaquil, who nodded slightly. Opportunity, Tarquinius said simply. And also divine direction. On the journey here we received an omen. An eagle, Jupiter's bird, descended and took my cap, lifted it to the heavens and returned it perfectly to my head. My wife, who is skilled in Etruscan augury, interpreted this as divine approval for our relocation and blessing for service to Rome. The guard's expression changed. Not skeptical. Romans took omens seriously, especially omens involving eagles and Jupiter. Interested. Impressed even. An eagle omen, the guard repeated. That's significant. That's Jupiter's personal attention. We witnessed it, one of the servants called from the wagon behind, helpfully confirming the story. The eagle took the cap and brought it back, placed it right on his head. We all saw it. Multiple witnesses, the guard said, nodding. This made it official. This made it real rather than just a story some foreigner told to make himself sound important. You should speak with the augurs, they'll want to hear this. And probably the Senate. They're currently managing Rome while the succession is decided. An omen like that is politically significant. We're happy to speak with anyone who wishes to hear the account, Tarquinius said. We're here to serve Rome in whatever capacity the gods and the city deem appropriate. The guard waved them through. Welcome to Rome. May your omen prove true. They passed through the gate into the city proper. Rome surrounded them immediately. Streets, buildings, people, the particular organized chaos of a city that was functional and busy and very much alive. More sophisticated than Tarquinius had expected from Etruscan descriptions. Less sophisticated than Tarquinius, certainly, but not embarrassingly so, just younger, rougher, still developing its character. "We're in," Tanaquil said quietly. That went perfectly. The guard believed the omen immediately, understood its significance, and suggested we speak with exactly the people we need to speak with. The eagle did good work. The eagle, or your interpretation? Tarquinius asked with mild amusement. Both? Tanaquil replied serenely. The gods provide opportunities. Skilled augurs help people understand what those opportunities mean. It's a collaborative process. They found an inn near the forum. Not the best accommodation, but acceptable for temporary residents while they established themselves and found permanent housing. The innkeeper was impressed by their obvious wealth, by the mention of Tarquinia, by the eagle omen story that Tanaquil told with perfect dramatic timing, while Tarquinius paid for rooms. An eagle omen, the innkeeper repeated, like everyone else, with the appropriate reverence. That's significant. That's Jupiter's attention. You should absolutely speak with the augurs and the Senate. Ancus Marcius just died. Rome is choosing a new king. An omen like yours is politically relevant. We'll seek audience appropriately, Tarquinius assured him. We're not here to push ourselves forward aggressively. But if the gods have indicated service to Rome, we won't refuse divine direction. It was perfectly pitched. Humble, but not too humble. Confident, but not arrogant. Suggesting both capability and deference to proper authority. The innkeeper approved. Word would spread. By tomorrow, half of Rome would have heard about the wealthy Etruscan with the eagle omen. That night, in their room at the inn, Tanaquil and Tarquinius reviewed their first day in Rome. That went better than expected, Tarquinius admitted. The guard took the omen seriously. The innkeeper is spreading the story. We have legitimate reason to approach the Senate without seeming presumptuous. Romans are more sophisticated than Etruscans give them credit for, Tanaquil observed. But they're also more credulous about omens. Etruscan augury is elaborate. We look for subtle signs, complex interpretations. Roman augury is more straightforward. Eagle takes cap, returns cap, must be Jupiter saying something important. They don't overthink it. Is that a problem? It's an advantage, Tanaquil corrected. Simple omens are harder to dispute. If we'd received some complex multi-part omen requiring elaborate interpretation, Roman augurs might argue about meaning. But an eagle taking and returning a cap, that's clear. That's unambiguous. That's Jupiter saying, "This man has my attention and approval." No one can argue with that without arguing with Jupiter, which Romans sensibly avoid. Tarquinius looked out the window at Rome spread below. The 7 hills, the walls, the forum somewhere in the darkness, where politics happened and kings were chosen and power was distributed according to rules he didn't quite understand yet, but would learn. "We're actually going to do this," he said quietly. "We're going to try for the crown." "We're going to succeed at trying for the crown," Tanaquil corrected. "The eagle has spoken. The gods have approved. Rome needs what we offer. All we have to do now is convince enough senators that accepting divine will is easier than fighting it. And if they reject us anyway, then we become wealthy. Respected residents of Rome and try again in a generation," Tanaquil said practically. "But I don't think they'll reject us. The timing is too perfect. The omen is too clear. And Rome, whether it knows it yet or not, needs exactly what we're offering." Outside, Rome continued its evening business. Somewhere in the city, senators were debating succession. Somewhere, priests were performing evening sacrifices. Somewhere, ordinary Romans were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that their next king had just arrived with divine endorsement and Etruscan sophistication and ambitions that would transform their city in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The eagle had spoken. Tarquinius had listened. Tanaquil had interpreted. And Rome, practical, powerful, recently kingless Rome, was about to get very interesting. Tomorrow, they would begin the actual work of becoming Romans, of meeting the right people, of telling the right stories, of positioning themselves so that when Rome chose its next king, choosing Tarquinius would feel inevitable rather than surprising. But tonight, rest. Tomorrow, politics. The day after, destiny. One step at a time. Just like the eagle, circling, descending, ascending, perfectly timed. Divine intervention looked a lot like careful planning, if you did it right. And Tanaquil always did it right. Integration into Roman society required strategy that was more subtle than the eagle omen, and more sustained than a single impressive entrance. Tarquinius and Tanaquil spent their first weeks in Rome learning, not announcing themselves immediately to the Senate, not pushing for political recognition before they understood Roman social dynamics, just watching, listening, making careful connections and establishing themselves as the kind of wealthy, sophisticated foreigners that Rome might actually want as citizens rather than viewing as threats. The first step was finding proper housing. Not the inn, which was adequate but temporary, and didn't project the kind of permanent residence that signaled commitment to Rome. They needed something impressive but not ostentatious, expensive but not offensive, clearly wealthy but appropriately respectful of Roman sensibilities about display. They found a house on the lower slope of the Esquiline Hill, not the most prestigious location that would have been the Palatine, where Romulus had founded Rome and where the oldest families maintained their ancestral homes, but respectable, well-positioned, large enough to demonstrate wealth without looking like they were trying to outdo Roman aristocracy immediately upon arrival. The Esquiline is appropriate, Tanaquil said, surveying the property. Visible enough to signal status. Not so prominent that we seem presumptuous. We're wealthy foreign residents, not invading conquerors. The location should reflect that. The house itself required work. It was Roman construction, solid, functional, completely lacking in aesthetic sophistication. Stone and timber and practical design that served purpose without considering beauty. We'll renovate. Tarquinius decided. Etruscan style. Frescoes. Proper interior decoration. Make it beautiful as well as functional. Romans will visit. See what Etruscan culture can do. Understand what we bring beyond just wealth. Carefully, Tanaquil cautioned. We want to impress, not alienate. Show sophistication without making Romans feel unsophisticated. That's a narrow line. The renovation became their first cultural demonstration. They hired Etruscan artisans who'd traveled to Rome for work. There was a small Etruscan community in the city, mostly craftsmen and traders, people who appreciated Tarquinius and Tanaquil's arrival as validation that Etruscan presence in Rome could be prestigious rather than just commercial. The frescoes went up first. Etruscan style, vibrant colors, elaborate scenes, the kind of interior decoration that made rooms feel artistic rather than just inhabited. Not overly complex, not showing off, just demonstrating that walls could be beautiful as well as structural. Roman visitors, neighbors, local merchants, people curious about the wealthy Etruscans came to see the work. Their reactions were predictable, initial surprise that anyone bothered decorating interior walls, followed by appreciation once they saw the results, followed by the slightly defensive comment that Romans could do this too if they wanted to, but had been focused on more practical matters. It's beautiful, one Roman neighbor admitted, looking at a fresco depicting a banquet scene. We don't have many interiors like this in Rome. Most people just don't think about decorating walls beyond maybe whitewashing them occasionally. Etruscan tradition, Tarquinius explained modestly. We've been doing interior decoration for generations. Part of how we make houses feel like homes rather than just shelters. If you're interested, I could introduce you to the artisans. They're quite skilled and happy to work with Roman clients. This was strategic generosity, offering to share Etruscan expertise rather than hoarding it, making themselves useful rather than just impressive. The neighbor accepted, commissioned his own modest frescoes, told other people about the helpful Etruscans on the Esquiline who weren't snobby about their cultural sophistication. Word spread, slowly, positively. The wealthy Etruscan couple were cultured but not condescending, sophisticated but friendly, foreign but interested in Roman integration rather than maintaining Etruscan separation, exactly the reputation they needed. The second step was religious participation. Romans were intensely religious, not in the mystical way Numa had been, but in the practical, obligation-based way of people who believed gods required proper service and provided tangible benefits in return. Festivals happened regularly. Sacrifices were expected. Public religious participation was how you demonstrated both piety and citizenship. Tarquinius and Tanaquil attended everything. When Rome held festivals to Jupiter, which happened frequently because Jupiter was important and Romans liked festivals, they were there. Well-dressed, respectful, participating appropriately, bringing generous offerings that weren't ostentatiously expensive but were clearly quality. The Etruscan couple, other attendees would note, they came to the Jupiter festival, brought a beautiful bull for sacrifice. Very respectful. When the Vestals performed their sacred duties, Tarquinius and Tanaquil watched with appropriate reverence. When the augurs took auspices for public events, they paid attention, asked intelligent questions, demonstrated that Etruscans understood Roman religious practices, even if Etruscan practices were different in details. "You know your augury," one Roman augur commented after a public ceremony where Tanaquil had asked thoughtful questions about chicken behavior interpretation. "That's rare for foreigners. Most people from other cities think their religious practices are superior and don't bother learning ours. Augury is important everywhere," Tanaquil replied diplomatically. "The methods differ. Etruscan augury uses different techniques than Roman, but the principle is the same, understanding divine will through observation of signs. I'm interested in Roman methods because I'm living in Rome now. It would be disrespectful to maintain only Etruscan practices without learning Roman ones." This was perfect, acknowledging Etruscan expertise while respecting Roman traditions, suggesting cultural exchange rather than cultural superiority. The augur approved, invited Tanaquil to observe more ceremonies, began introducing her to other priests. Religious participation opened social doors. Romans who saw Tarquinius and Tanaquil at festivals, who observed their appropriate piety, who noted their generous offerings and respectful behavior, began thinking of them less as foreign residents and more as wealthy members of the community who happened to have Etruscan origins. Integration through ritual. It was working. The third step was patronage. Tarquinius had wealth, significant wealth from selling his Tarquinian properties, from his father's Greek trading connections, from years of successful commerce. Wealth that was currently not doing anything except sitting in strong boxes and occasionally being spent on household expenses and religious offerings. Wealth that could, with strategic deployment, buy influence and goodwill, and the kind of social capital that made foreigners acceptable to tradition-minded Romans. He began lending money, not to wealthy Romans who didn't need it, to younger Romans from good families who needed capital for business ventures or property purchases, or the various expensive undertakings that required resources they didn't yet have. Lending at reasonable interest with flexible terms, with the kind of generosity that wasn't quite charity but was close enough to create obligation. "You're building a client base," Tanaquil observed, watching him arrange another loan to a young Roman from a patrician family. "Creating people who owe you favors. I'm helping Romans achieve their goals," Tarquinius corrected with a slight smile. "If they feel grateful and obligated, that's just natural human response to generosity. I'm not demanding anything in return. Yet," Tanaquil added. "Yet," Tarquinius agreed. The clients multiplied. The young patrician who borrowed money to start a trading venture. The established merchant who needed capital to expand his workshop. The father who wanted to provide dowry for his daughter but had his wealth tied up in property. All of them received generous loans from the wealthy Etruscan who charged reasonable interest and didn't demand immediate repayment, and seemed genuinely interested in helping Romans prosper. "Tarquinius helped me when my father's property was disputed in court," one young Roman told his friends. "Lent me money for the legal proceedings, didn't demand repayment until the case was settled. He's generous for a foreigner, for anyone really." The Etruscan couple funded the new fountain in the Forum, another Roman mentioned. "Just donated the money, said they wanted to contribute to Rome's improvement. Didn't even ask for their names on it. Actually, they had asked for their names on it. Just subtly, in a way that looked modest rather than self-aggrandizing. But the point stood. Tarquinius and Tanaquil were spending money on Roman improvement, not just on personal luxury, public works, private patronage, religious generosity. It all added up to a reputation as wealthy, cultured foreigners who genuinely wanted to be part of Rome, rather than just living in Rome while maintaining Etruscan separation. The clients became advocates. People who, when Tarquinius's name came up in conversation, would say positive things. "He's been very helpful. She knows her augury. They're respectful of Roman traditions. The eagle omen was clearly genuine. Jupiter doesn't endorse people without reason." The eagle omen remained part of their reputation. People mentioned it. The story spread, became more elaborate with each retelling, which was fine, which was helpful. Some versions had the eagle circling 3 times for the 3 parts of Jupiter's nature. Some had thunder in the distance. Some had Tanaquil predicting the interpretation before the eagle even returned the cap. None of these details were accurate, but they were believable, and they reinforced the central message. Jupiter had blessed Tarquinius with divine attention. The gods approved of his presence in Rome. 6 months after arriving in Rome, Tarquinius and Tanaquil had successfully transitioned from foreign residents to community members. Known, respected, wealthy but generous, sophisticated but not snobby, foreign but integrated. And Rome still hadn't chosen its new king. The succession question was complicated. Ancus Marcius had died peacefully, unlike Tullus Hostelius. No lightning, no divine vengeance, just natural death from age and illness. He left 2 adult sons who theoretically had some claim to succession based on being the previous king's sons. But Rome didn't do hereditary monarchy. Never had. Each king was chosen by the people, or more accurately, chosen by the Senate, and confirmed by the popular assembly through the specific Roman system of election that was complicated enough that nobody was entirely sure how it worked, except that it involved auspices and public acclamation, and the Senate's approval being technically required. Ancus's sons expected to be considered. They were Roman aristocracy, sons of a successful king, connected to good families through their mother's lineage. Young, but not too young. Capable, probably, certainly ambitious enough to want the crown, but the Senate was hesitant. Ancus's reign had been fine, competent, functional, adequately successful, without being spectacular. Exactly the kind of moderate, practical governance that nobody complained about while it was happening, and nobody felt particularly inspired by afterward. The Senate wanted someone who might take Rome in a new direction, someone with vision, someone who could make Rome more than just adequately successful. The debate dragged on for months. Different factions supporting different candidates. Some senators wanted another member of Ancus's family to maintain continuity. Others wanted someone from a completely different lineage to avoid potential dynasty formation. Some wanted a military leader like Tullus. Others wanted a religious figure like Numa. Everyone had opinions, nobody had consensus. Rome needs to decide. Tarquinius observed to Tanaquil during one of their evening conversations about Roman politics. They'd been carefully following the succession debate, listening to gossip, understanding the various factions and their concerns. Rome needs a candidate who isn't controversial, Tanaquil corrected. Someone acceptable to multiple factions. Someone who offers something new without threatening existing power structures too dramatically. They looked at each other. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," Tarquinius said. "I'm thinking that we've been in Rome for 6 months," Tanaquil replied. "We're known, respected, wealthy, generous. We have the eagle omen as divine endorsement. We're foreign, which means we're not part of any existing Roman faction. We don't threaten any particular family's power because we're not competing within established Roman hierarchies. We bring Etruscan sophistication that Rome wants but doesn't have. And crucially, we're not Ancus's sons, which means choosing us doesn't look like dynasty formation. We're also foreign," Tarquinius pointed out. "That could be a problem. Or it could be a solution," Tanaquil countered. Rome's last 4 kings were a Roman, a Sabine, a Roman, and a Roman-Latin hybrid. They've shown willingness to accept outsiders before. And right now, with Roman factions deadlocked, an outsider who belongs to no faction might be exactly what they need. "This is ambitious," Tarquinius said. "This is what the eagle predicted," Tanaquil reminded him. "Jupiter's bird took your cap to the heavens and returned it to your head. That's not symbolism for become a wealthy, respected resident. That's symbolism for receive high office. We've been waiting to see if Rome would choose you naturally. It hasn't. Maybe it's time to make ourselves available for consideration more actively." Tarquinius considered this. They'd spent 6 months building reputation, establishing goodwill, becoming integrated. They had clients who owed them favors. They had religious credibility through Tanaquil's augury knowledge. They had wealth to support their candidacy. They had the eagle omen as divine endorsement. They had everything except an actual claim to the kingship. But then, nobody in Rome had a clear claim. That was the whole problem. The succession was open, contested, waiting for someone to emerge as the obvious choice. Maybe that someone could be an ambitious Etruscan with divine endorsement, and a wife who was extremely good at political strategy. "We'd need support," Tarquinius said. "Senate support? We can't just announce candidacy and hope people vote for us. We need actual backing from important Romans. We need to call in the favors we've been accumulating," Tanaquil agreed. "The clients we've helped, the families we've patronized, the priests who respect my augury knowledge. We need to organize them into a faction supporting your candidacy before anyone realizes that's what we're doing." "And if it fails?" Tarquinius asked. "If we push for kingship and Rome rejects us, we'll have overreached. We'll be the presumptuous foreigners who thought they deserved to rule. Our reputation will be damaged. Then we fail spectacularly and become a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding wisdom," Tanaquil said calmly. "But I don't think we'll fail. I think Rome is waiting for someone to make this decision. The Senate is deadlocked because everyone is waiting for someone else to propose the obvious solution. We're going to be that solution." She was right. Probably. Tanaquil was usually right about political calculations. She understood people, understood power, understood how to position things, so that your ambitious goals looked like reasonable solutions to other people's problems. We do this carefully, Tarquinius said, making the decision. We don't announce publicly. We talk to the right people privately. We let them think they're discovering us as a candidate, rather than us pushing ourselves forward. We make it their idea. Exactly, Tanaquil agreed. That's how clever people gain power. They let other people think they're in charge of the decision. The Senate needs to believe they're choosing you wisely, not that you've manipulated them into choosing you, even though we are manipulating them. Especially because we are manipulating them. Tanaquil confirmed. The best manipulation is invisible. People should feel like they made wise choices based on divine omens and political necessity, not like they were maneuvered into specific conclusions by ambitious foreigners. Outside their window, Rome continued its evening routines. Somewhere in the city, senators were meeting, debating, arguing about succession. Somewhere Ancus's sons were probably frustrated that their obvious claim wasn't being recognized. Somewhere, other ambitious men were considering whether they might have a chance at the crown, but none of them had an eagle omen. None of them had Etruscan sophistication. None of them had Tanaquil managing their political strategy. Tomorrow, they would begin making careful suggestions to the right people, reminding them of the eagle omen, mentioning Tarquinius's capabilities, suggesting that perhaps Rome needed a king who wasn't part of existing factions, who brought new expertise, who had clear divine endorsement and no competing loyalties to established Roman families. Tomorrow, the campaign began, quietly, subtly, invisibly. Tonight, they planned, because planning was what separated successful ambition from failed presumption. Planning was what made impossible things become inevitable. The eagle had spoken 6 months ago. Jupiter had given his endorsement. Now it was time to see if Rome was listening. And if Rome wasn't listening yet, Tanaquil would make sure they started. That's what politically brilliant wives did. They turned divine omens into political reality through careful application of strategy, timing, and the strategic deployment of favors owed by grateful clients. The courtship of Rome was entering its final phase. The careful cultivation of reputation was about to become active pursuit of power, and Rome, deadlocked, uncertain, waiting for someone to solve their succession problem, was about to discover that sometimes the solution came from unexpected directions. Sometimes it came from Etruria, with an eagle's blessing and a brilliant woman's planning. Sometimes it came from exactly where you weren't looking, which made it perfect, because Rome never saw Tarquinius coming until he was already there. The first approach was to Marcus Porcius, a senator from an old patrician family who had borrowed money from Tarquinius 9 months earlier to expand his wine trading business. Tarquinius didn't go to him demanding support or calling in the debt, obviously. That would have been crude. Instead, he arranged an apparently coincidental meeting at the Forum, expressed interest in how the wine business was progressing, and casually mentioned that Rome's succession question must be challenging for the Senate. "It's a mess," Marcus admitted. They were standing near one of the market stalls, ostensibly examining pottery, but really just having the kind of public conversation that looked casual but was actually quite deliberate. "We've been debating for 8 months. Every faction has their preferred candidate. Nobody has consensus. Ancus's sons think they deserve it by Hidiki, but Rome doesn't work that way. Other families are pushing their own candidates. It's deadlocked." "What does Rome need?" Tarquinius asked. "Not who does Rome need, what?" Focusing on qualities rather than specific people. Making the conversation about criteria rather than candidates. Marcus considered someone acceptable to multiple factions. Someone who won't tip power too far toward any particular family. Someone with capability and resources. We can't afford another king who needs building from nothing. Someone the gods approve of, obviously, because divine displeasure is expensive. He was probably thinking about Tullus and the lightning. "Those are challenging criteria to satisfy simultaneously," Tarquinius observed. "Exactly why we've been deadlocked for 8 months, Marcus said with some frustration. Every candidate satisfies some criteria but fails others. Ancus's sons are capable but create dynasty concerns. The military candidates are strong but alienate the religious faction. The religious candidates are pious but lack practical experience. Nobody is obviously right." Tarquinius nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this problem for the first time, rather than having analysed it extensively with Tanaquil for weeks. "What about someone outside the usual Roman factions? Someone who doesn't threaten existing power structures because they're not competing within them?" Marcus looked at him. Not immediately comprehending, or perhaps comprehending but needing to think about it before responding. "You're suggesting yourself," Marcus said after a moment. "Not accusatory, just clarifying. I'm suggesting that Rome might benefit from considering candidates who don't fit the traditional patterns," Tarquinius replied carefully. "I've been here nearly a year. I've tried to be useful, lending money, funding public improvements, participating in religious observances, learning Roman customs. The eagle omen suggested Jupiter has some interest in my presence here. I'm not saying I'm the obvious choice. I'm saying that someone like me, outside factional politics, bringing resources and expertise Rome doesn't currently have, with apparent divine endorsement, might satisfy criteria that traditional candidates don't." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking this through. The political calculations were visible on his face. Tarquinius as king would mean Marcus owed a significant debt to the king, which was valuable. Tarquinius was foreign, which meant he'd need Roman advisors and supporters, which created opportunity. Tarquinius had no Roman power base, which meant he wouldn't threaten Marcus's family's position. The eagle omen was genuine. Multiple witnesses, clear symbolism, hard to dispute. "The Senate would debate whether a foreigner should be king," Marcus said slowly. "Rome has accepted a Sabine king before. Numa was Sabine, but Etruscans are different, more foreign. Some senators would object on principle. Some senators will object to any candidate on principle," Tarquinius replied. "That's why you're deadlocked. The question is whether enough senators would accept an Etruscan candidate to form consensus, particularly an Etruscan candidate who has demonstrated Roman integration, who brings wealth and expertise, who has divine endorsement, and who owes his position to Senate support rather than having independent power base that might threaten them." That last point was strategic. Senators liked kings who needed them. Kings who had their own faction were dangerous. They could ignore Senate advice, consolidate power independently, become tyrannical. But a foreign king who owed his entire position to Senate support and had no Roman faction, that king would need to maintain Senate goodwill to stay in power. From the Senate's perspective, Tarquinius was controllable, which made him attractive despite being foreign. "I'll mention this to some people," Marcus said carefully. "Not committing fully, but not rejecting either. Testing the waters. See how they respond to the idea, quietly. If there's interest, we'll talk more formally." "I appreciate that," Tarquinius said. "I'm not pushing myself forward aggressively, but if Rome needs a king, and I satisfy criteria that traditional candidates don't, I'm willing to serve." The eagle suggested Jupiter has some purpose for me here. "I'm trying to understand what that purpose might be." They parted. Marcus went to talk quietly with other senators. Tarquinius went home to report to Tanaquil that the first approach had gone well. Not guaranteed success, but definite interest, which was the first step. "He'll talk to others," Tarquinius said. "Frame it as his own idea." "What about the Etruscan? He satisfies unusual criteria. Let them think they're discovering you rather than responding to your campaign." "Perfect," Tanaquil said. "That's exactly how this should work. Now we need to approach others. Different angles for different people. The religious senators hear about my augury expertise and your eagle omen. The practical senators hear about your wealth and infrastructure knowledge. The military senators hear about Etruscan military tactics and training. Everyone gets a version that appeals to their specific concerns. We're building a coalition without anyone realizing they're part of a coalition," Tarquinius observed. "Exactly," Tanaquil confirmed. "By the time the Senate formally debates your candidacy, enough senators will already privately support you that consensus looks inevitable rather than surprising." The second approach was to Gaius Claudius, a senator particularly concerned with religious propriety. Tanaquil handled this one personally. Women didn't participate in Senate debates directly, but they could absolutely influence senators through careful conversation at religious festivals and social gatherings. She found him at a sacrifice to Vesta, positioned herself nearby during the ceremony, made sure to demonstrate appropriate reverence. Afterward, as people were discussing the ritual, she offered a thoughtful comment about the auspices that showed both knowledge and respect for Roman practices. "You understand augury well," Gaius observed. "Better than most foreigners who attend our ceremonies." "Etruscan augury is very developed," Tanaquil replied modestly. "We've practiced it for centuries. Different techniques than Roman augury in some ways, but the same fundamental principle, understanding divine will through observation. I've been studying Roman methods since arriving here. Your augurs are skilled, though they interpret signs differently than Etruscan augurs would." "How so?" Gaius was interested. Religious senators were always interested in comparative augury discussion. Roman augury relies heavily on bird observation and chicken behavior. Tanaquil explained. Very practical, very direct. Etruscan augury is more complex. We use liver inspection, lightning patterns, elaborate sky division for bird flight interpretation. More sophisticated in some ways, though possibly overcomplicated. Roman simplicity has advantages. Your omens are clear, understandable to everyone, not requiring elaborate priestly interpretation. This was diplomatic, acknowledging Etruscan expertise while praising Roman practicality, not claiming superiority, just explaining difference. The eagle omen your husband received, Gaius said, transitioning to the topic Tanaquil had been hoping he'd raise. That was significant. Clear divine messaging. Jupiter doesn't send omens like that casually. No, he doesn't, Tanaquil agreed. It was unmistakable. The eagle, Jupiter's sacred bird, removing and replacing the cap directly on his head. The symbolism is obvious to anyone trained in augury. Removal and replacement of status, blessed by divine attention. We've been trying to understand what Jupiter intended by it. Some might say it indicated kingship. Gaius suggested carefully, testing whether Tanaquil would acknowledge this interpretation or deflect. Some have suggested that Tanaquil replied equally carefully. It's certainly one possible interpretation. Eagles represent authority. The cap represents office. The heavens represent divine realm. Removal to heaven and return blessed by divine presence. Yes, kingship is a reasonable interpretation, though it seemed presumptuous to assume that immediately, particularly as foreigners newly arrived in Rome. But 8 months have passed, Gaius pointed out. Rome still hasn't chosen a king. Perhaps Jupiter's timeline is longer than our immediate expectations. Perhaps the omen was looking forward to when Rome would need someone the gods had already indicated approval for. Tanaquil let that sit for a moment, as if considering it for the first time, rather than having planned this exact conversation. That's possible, she said thoughtfully. The gods do work on their own timeline, and Rome does need a king. I hear the Senate is struggling to reach consensus. If Jupiter indicated my husband for service to Rome, and Rome needs leadership, perhaps the timing is finally aligning with divine intention. Would your husband accept kingship if the Senate offered it? Gaius asked directly, not dancing around the question anymore, just asking clearly. I believe he would consider it a sacred duty, Tanaquil replied. If Jupiter sent an omen indicating service to Rome, refusing that service would be impious. My husband is many things, but he's not impious. He respects the gods. He respects Rome. If the Senate believed the eagle omen indicated divine approval for kingship, and if the Senate and people chose him accordingly, he would serve as the gods and Rome directed. It was perfectly said. Not ambitious. Dutiful. Not grasping for power. Responding to divine calling. Not presumptuous. Respectful of Senate authority to make the actual choice. I'll consider this, Gaius said. The religious perspective matters in succession. We can't choose a king the gods disapprove of. Not after Tullus. If Jupiter has already indicated approval through clear omen, that's politically and religiously significant. They parted. Tanaquil had just secured another senator's interest, possibly support, definitely willingness to consider Tarquinius seriously. 2 down. Several dozen more to approach through similar careful conversations. The campaign continued through careful individual approaches over the following month. Tarquinius talked to senators concerned about Roman infrastructure, mentioning his knowledge of Etruscan engineering and architecture. Rome is powerful but could be more impressive. Could have better temples, better public spaces, better visual representation of its strength. I've seen what Etruscan cities achieve with proper planning. I could bring that expertise to Rome if Rome wanted it. Tanaquil talked to senators' wives, who had significant informal influence over their husbands. Your husband is concerned about the succession crisis. Has he considered that sometimes the solution comes from unexpected sources? The gods work mysteriously. That eagle omen was very clear about divine approval. They hosted dinners at their house, inviting carefully selected senators and their families. Let people see the Etruscan interior decoration, the sophisticated hospitality, the cultural refinement that Rome lacked. This is what Etruscan expertise looks like applied to daily life. Imagine what it could look like applied to public buildings. They donated to more public projects. A new fountain, repairs to a temple, funding for festival celebrations. Each donation was modest enough not to look like buying influence, but generous enough to be noticed and appreciated. The Etruscans are very supportive of Rome, very invested in the city's success. After 6 weeks of careful approaches, approximately a third of the Senate was privately supportive of Tarquinius's candidacy. Another third was curious, open to considering it. The final third ranged from skeptical to opposed. But even the opposed faction wasn't uniformly hostile. Mostly they were concerned about precedent, about whether accepting an Etruscan king would encourage too much foreign influence. "We're close," Tarquinius assessed. "We have enough support to propose formally. Not enough to guarantee success, but enough that the proposal won't be immediately rejected. Once it's formally debated, we can work with wavering senators." "Who should propose?" Tarquinius asked. "Not us. That would look too self-interested." "Marcus Porcius," Tarquinius decided. "He owes you significantly. His wine business is thriving because of your loan. He's from old patrician family, so has credibility. And he's the first senator you approached, which means he can frame this as his own careful consideration rather than responding to your campaign. He discovered you as a candidate through thoughtful analysis of Rome's needs, not through your self-promotion." They approached Marcus, who agreed. "I'll bring it to Senate debate," he said. "Frame it carefully. Emphasize the criteria Rome needs. Show how traditional candidates fail various requirements. Present you as satisfying multiple criteria simultaneously. Make it look like logical solution rather than radical departure." The formal proposal happened 3 days later during a Senate session, ostensibly about succession in general, but really about whether anyone would finally propose a specific candidate who could break the deadlock. Marcus stood. "Senators, we've debated succession for 9 months without consensus. Perhaps we've been looking for the wrong qualities. We keep seeking candidates who fit traditional patterns. Roman aristocrat, military leader, religious figure. But every traditional candidate fails some crucial requirement. Maybe Rome needs someone non-traditional." This got attention. Senators looked interested. Anything was better than continuing the same circular debates they'd been having for months. "Consider what Rome needs," Marcus continued. "Divine approval. Obviously essential after Tullus's lightning. Wealth and resources. We can't afford a poor king who burdens Rome. Political neutrality. Someone who won't tip power towards specific factions. Expertise Rome lacks. Knowledge that improves the city. And capability to govern effectively, without threatening Senate authority." He paused, letting those criteria sink in. Traditional candidates satisfy some requirements but fail others. But there's someone in Rome who satisfies all of them. Someone the gods have clearly blessed through eagle omen, witnessed by multiple people. Someone wealthy enough to support kingship without draining Roman treasury. Someone outside Roman factions because he's not Roman, which means he needs Senate support to maintain power and won't threaten any particular family's position. Someone bringing Etruscan expertise in architecture, engineering and religious practices that could make Rome more impressive. Someone capable but politically dependent on us. "You're proposing the Etruscan," another senator said. "Not hostile, just clarifying." "Lucius Tarquinius, I'm proposing we consider whether Rome's next king might come from outside Rome," Marcus replied carefully. "We accepted a Sabine king. Numa was foreign but proved Rome's greatest spiritual leader. Tarquinius is foreign but offers different expertise. And crucially, his eagle omen is undeniable. Jupiter doesn't send signs like that without purpose. Maybe we've been looking for Roman solutions when the gods have already indicated a non-Roman answer." The Senate erupted into debate. Some senators were immediately interested. This broke the deadlock by introducing a completely different option. Some were skeptical. Foreigners as king set dangerous precedent. Some wanted time to consider. This was unexpected, required thought. Some were hostile. Absolutely not. Rome should be ruled by Romans. But notably, nobody was indifferent. The proposal had successfully disrupted the stalemate. Whether Tarquinius ultimately won or lost, the succession question was finally moving forward rather than remaining frozen in factional gridlock. "We should meet him formally," one senator suggested. "If we're seriously considering an Etruscan king, we need to understand his capabilities, his intentions, his understanding of Roman governance." "Agreed," others said. "Bring him before the Senate. Let him speak for himself. Let us judge directly rather than through second-hand reports." Marcus looked satisfied. This was exactly what they'd wanted. Formal Senate consideration, direct evaluation, the opportunity for Tarquinius to present himself on his own terms, rather than just being discussed as abstract possibility. "I'll arrange it," Marcus said. 2 days later, Tarquinius stood before the Roman Senate, in the Curia where Rome's political power resided, facing the assembled senators who would decide whether an ambitious Etruscan with an eagle omen could become Rome's 5th king. "Senators," he began, "thank you for this opportunity to address you directly." His Latin was perfect, slightly accented with Etruscan phonetics, but fluent, clear, respectful. He'd been practicing for months, knowing this moment would come eventually if their campaign succeeded. I came to Rome a year ago seeking opportunity that Tarquinia denied me, due to my father's Greek heritage. Rome's reputation as a city that valued capability over pure ancestry attracted me. I hoped to become a respected resident, contribute to Roman prosperity, and perhaps eventually achieve citizenship. Then the Eagle Omen happened. An event I did not seek, did not arrange, but which clearly indicated Jupiter's attention. My wife, skilled in Etruscan augury, interpreted it as blessing for high service to Rome. We didn't presume to understand exactly what that meant, but we committed to being worthy of divine notice through service to this city. For a year, I've tried to be useful, lending money to Romans pursuing business ventures, funding public improvements, participating in religious ceremonies, learning Roman customs, not because I sought political office, I'm foreign. That seemed impossible, but because the Eagle Omen suggested I owed Rome my best efforts. Now Senator Marcus tells me the Senate considers me for kingship. This is unexpected. I'm Etruscan. I'm outside your traditional power structures. But perhaps that's exactly what Jupiter intended. Perhaps Rome needs a king who brings new expertise, who's politically neutral because he has no Roman faction, who's dependent on Senate support and therefore respects Senate authority, who can make Rome more impressive without threatening any particular family's position. I offer Etruscan knowledge of architecture and engineering. I can make Rome beautiful as well as powerful. I offer wealth. I won't burden your treasury. I'll support royal duties with my own resources. I offer political neutrality. I have no competing loyalties to Roman families, no hidden agenda beyond serving Rome well because my entire position depends on your continued support. And I offer divine endorsement. The Eagle Omen was real. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. Jupiter blessed me for something, if that something is kingship. Refusing it would be impious. I respect the gods. I respect Rome. If you choose me, I'll serve both as faithfully as capability allows. But I'm not demanding your choice. I'm not threatening consequences if you reject me. I'm simply stating that I'm available if Rome decides an Etruscan king with divine blessing and useful expertise satisfies needs that traditional candidates don't. He stopped. No dramatic conclusion. No emotional appeal. No grasping for power. Just clear statement of what he offered and why it might solve Rome's succession problem. The Senate debated for 3 hours after Tarquinius left. Arguments for divine approval through Eagle Omen, political neutrality and dependence on Senate, Etruscan expertise Rome lacked, wealth to support kingship, breaking the factional deadlock, arguments against, dangerous precedent of foreign kings, insufficient connection to Roman traditions, risk of Etruscan cultural dominance, uncertainty about loyalty to Rome versus Etruria, but gradually, consensus formed. Not unanimous. Some senators remained opposed. But enough support that the proposal could proceed to the people for final confirmation through the traditional Roman election process that was complicated enough that Tanaquil had spent weeks studying it to understand how to manage it. 7 days after Tarquinius's Senate address, the Comitia Curiata, the popular assembly organized by Curiae, met to confirm the Senate's nomination. The augurs took auspices. The birds flew favorably. The chickens ate enthusiastically. No thunder interrupted. The gods, it appeared, approved. The people voted. Not unanimously. Some Romans were uncomfortable with foreign king, but majority supported the Senate's choice, trusting that senators understood Rome's needs better than average citizens did. The result was announced at sunset. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Etruscan merchant who'd arrived in Rome barely a year earlier with an eagle omen and ambitions he'd hidden carefully behind generous patronage and sophisticated hospitality, was declared Rome's 5th king. "All hail King Tarquinius," the herald announced. "May the gods bless his reign and Rome's continued prosperity." Tarquinius stood on the steps of the Curia, looking at Rome spread before him. The city he'd entered as foreign resident, the city that had just given him authority over everything within its walls and beyond. Beside him, not officially, women didn't stand on Curia steps during official ceremonies, but close enough, Tanaquil watched with satisfaction. The eagle omen had proved accurate. The campaign had worked. The impossible had become inevitable through careful planning and strategic favor deployment. Rome had chosen an Etruscan king, not because he was Etruscan, but because he satisfied criteria no Roman candidate could match. Not because he demanded power, but because Rome needed what he offered. It was perfect. It was dangerous. It was dangerous. It was beginning. The reign of Tarquinius Priscus. Rome's first foreign king since the Sabine Numa had commenced, and Rome would never be quite the same. The first thing Tarquinius did as king was nothing dramatic. No immediate military campaigns, no sweeping religious reforms, no purges of potential rivals or consolidation of power through violence. Just administrative work, the unglamorous, necessary tasks of understanding how Roman governance actually functioned beyond Senate debates and popular assemblies. "I need to understand the systems before changing anything," he explained to Tarquinius during his first weeks as king. Ancus built infrastructure carefully because he understood what Rome needed. Tullus fought wars successfully because he understood Roman military organization. "I can't improve what I don't comprehend." So he met with magistrates, learned how taxes were collected and distributed, understood the agricultural calendar and its religious obligations, studied how the army recruited and trained soldiers, examined how legal disputes were settled and precedents were established. It was boring. Absolutely boring. The kind of detailed governance work that never appeared in stories about legendary kings but determined whether kingdoms actually functioned or just looked impressive while collapsing internally. The senators approved. A foreign king who spent his first months learning Roman systems rather than imposing Etruscan practices was exactly what they'd hoped for. Someone bringing new expertise but respecting existing structures. Someone dependent on Roman knowledge because he didn't arrive assuming he knew better. "He's being appropriately cautious," senators told each other. "Learning before acting. That's wise. That's respectful. We made the right choice." After 3 months of careful study, Tarquinius began making changes. Small ones initially, testing whether the Senate would accept his authority, whether Romans would follow an Etruscan king's directions, whether his political position was secure enough to actually govern rather than just ceremonially occupying the throne. He reformed tax collection. Not dramatically, just made it more efficient by applying Etruscan accounting methods that reduced corruption opportunities. Revenue increased slightly. Nobody complained because nobody was paying more. The system was just catching money that had previously disappeared into collector pockets. He reorganized military training again, not radically, just incorporated some Etruscan drill techniques that made formations more precise. The soldiers grumbled initially because all soldiers grumble about changes to routine, then admitted the new system worked better. Small improvements, careful changes, building trust through competent administration. And then, 6 months into his reign, he proposed something ambitious. "Rome needs a circus," Tarquinius announced to the Senate. The senators looked confused. Romans knew what circuses were. Etruscans had them. Greeks had similar structures. They were venues for public games and chariot races, and the kind of mass entertainment that cities used to keep populations happy and demonstrate cultural sophistication. Rome didn't have one. Rome had an open field where occasional festivals happened, where military triumphs were celebrated, where people gathered for important announcements. But no permanent structure, no dedicated venue for games. "Why?" one senator asked practically. "We manage without a circus currently. Public festivals happen adequately in available spaces." "Rome manages," Tarquinius agreed. "But Rome could excel. A circus, a proper circus, permanently built, designed for spectacle, would serve multiple purposes. Entertainment, obviously, keeping the population happy, but also prestige. When foreign delegations visit Rome, when neighboring cities send ambassadors, what do we show them? Functional infrastructure, adequate temples, competent military. Everything works, but nothing impresses beyond simple capability. A circus would demonstrate that Rome isn't just powerful. Rome is sophisticated. Rome has culture. Rome builds monuments worthy of its strength rather than just practical structures that serve immediate needs." "This sounds expensive," another senator observed. The constant concern whenever kings proposed anything ambitious. "I'll fund much of it personally," Tarquinius replied. "Not all. This should be Roman construction, Roman achievement, not just Etruscan king's pet project. But I'll contribute significantly. I have the wealth. I want to spend it on something that benefits Rome permanently, rather than just supporting my own household." This was strategic. Tarquinius funding the circus himself meant senators couldn't complain about excessive treasury expenditure. But making it partially Roman-funded meant the circus would be Roman achievement, not just foreign imposition. Shared investment created shared ownership. "Where would we build it?" someone asked. Warming to the idea, or at least willing to hear more details. "The valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills," Tarquinius said. He'd studied Rome's geography carefully. "Currently it's just open ground. We level it properly, build permanent seating, create a racetrack for chariot racing, add facilities for other games. Its perfect location, central, accessible from multiple hills, large enough for substantial crowds. He unrolled plans, actual architectural drawings done in Etruscan style, showing detailed layout, seating arrangements, construction techniques. The kind of professional planning that demonstrated this wasn't whim but carefully considered proposal. The senators examined the drawings. Some looked impressed by the sophistication. Others looked nervous about the scale. Most looked curious about what permanent circus would mean for Rome's identity and prestige. This would be the largest structure Rome has built, one senator observed. Larger than any temple, larger than Ancus's bridge. This would define Rome's visual character. Yes, Tarquinius confirmed. That's the point. Rome is powerful enough to deserve impressive architecture. This circus would announce to everyone, Roman citizens, foreign visitors, neighboring cities, that Rome has arrived as a major power, not just militarily through conquest, but culturally through the kind of permanent public architecture that defines great civilizations. The debate lasted weeks. Some senators loved the idea. Finally, something that would make Rome visually impressive rather than just functionally adequate. Others worried about expense, about construction time, about whether Romans would actually use a circus enough to justify its cost. A few worried that Etruscan-style architecture would make Rome look too Etruscan, though Tarquinius had been careful to design something that incorporated Roman elements alongside Etruscan techniques. Eventually, the Senate approved. Partially because the proposal was genuinely appealing, who didn't want Rome to be more impressive? Partially because Tarquinius was funding much of it himself, reducing financial risk. Partially because saying no to the king's first major proposal after 6 months of careful, competent governance would be politically awkward. Construction on the Circus Maximus, the Great Circus, Rome's first permanent entertainment venue, began in the second year of Tarquinius's reign. The construction was enormous, unprecedented in Roman experience. First, the valley between the Palatine and Aventine had to be leveled properly. It was naturally suited for circus construction. Long, relatively flat valley, perfect for a racetrack, but still required extensive earthwork to create the precise level surface needed for chariot racing. Where uneven ground could cause crashes and kill expensive horses, hundreds of workers laboured on the earthwork. Tarquinius imported Etruscan engineers who knew how to grade large surfaces accurately, but used Roman labour for the actual work. Employment for Romans, expertise from Etruscans, joint effort that made the circus feel Roman, even though Etruscan knowledge made it possible. This is a lot of dirt, one Roman worker observed to his companion while moving approximately the 1,000th basket of soil from high spots to low spots. And truly impressive amount of dirt. I didn't know dirt moving could be this elaborate. The Etruscan engineers say it has to be perfect, his companion replied. Level within a finger's width across the entire track. Otherwise chariots crash and aristocrats complain about their dead horses. Aristocrats always complain? The first worker said philosophically. But I suppose keeping their horses alive is worth moving extraordinary amounts of dirt. The track took shape gradually over months. Packed earth, carefully graded, marked out in the oval shape that Etruscan circuses used. Long straightaways on the sides, tight turns on the ends where skilled chariot drivers could gain advantage, and unskilled ones would crash spectacularly, which was also entertaining. Then came the seating. Not stone. Stone seating was expensive and permanent, and suggested overconfidence about the circus's success. Wooden seating initially could be improved later if the circus proved popular. Built into the hillsides on both sides of the track, taking advantage of natural elevation so spectators could see without needing elaborate elevated structures. The seating construction revealed Roman enthusiasm for the project. People came to watch the building, brought their families, discussed where they'd sit when the circus opened, imagined the races and games that would happen here. "My family will sit there," one Roman pointed out to his children, indicating a section of partially completed wooden benches. "We'll watch chariot races. We'll see the greatest drivers in Italy competing. This will be better than the old open field festivals." "Will there be food?" one child asked, because children always ask the important questions. "Presumably vendors will sell food," the father replied. "Circuses have vendors. That's part of the experience. We'll watch races, eat overpriced snacks, complain about the referee decisions, and argue about which team should have won." "This sounds wonderful," the child said, already invested in circus culture before the circus even opened. Tarquinius visited the construction site regularly. Not micromanaging, he'd hired competent people and trusted them to work. but staying visible, showing that the king cared about this project personally, talking with workers about progress and challenges. The king comes here himself. Workers told each other appreciatively. Doesn't just send representatives. Actually talks to us. Asks about our work. Remembers our names. This was strategic relationship building. Tarquinius was foreign, was Etruscan, needed to establish connection with ordinary Romans beyond just Senate politics. The circus construction provided opportunity to interact with workers, demonstrate that despite being wealthy foreign king, he cared about Roman labourers, show that Etruscan sophistication didn't mean Etruscan arrogance. After 18 months of construction, the Circus Maximus was complete enough for inaugural games. Not finished. The finishing touches would take years. Permanent improvements would continue for generations. Romans would keep elaborating the circus for centuries. But functional, ready for use, ready to demonstrate what Etruscan engineering expertise could create for Rome's entertainment. The inaugural games were scheduled for the festival of Consus, the god of stored grain, which traditionally included horse racing and made perfect timing for circus opening. Tarquinius spared no expense on the games themselves. He'd spent significant personal wealth on the circus construction. Now he'd spend more on making the opening impressive enough that Romans would want to return, would make circus games a regular expectation rather than one-time novelty. He imported professional chariot drivers from Etruscan cities. Not permanently. Romans would develop their own drivers eventually, but for the inaugural games, he wanted the best drivers Italy could offer, competing in Rome's new circus. He brought exotic animals for display, not combat. Rome hadn't developed the appetite for blood sport that would characterize later circus games, but impressive creatures that Romans rarely saw. Lions from North Africa, bears from northern forests, an elephant which caused absolute chaos because nobody in Rome had seen an elephant before and weren't entirely sure it was a real animal, rather than elaborate artistic construction. That's an elephant, Tarquinius explained to the crowd during the animal display. They're from Africa and Asia, very large, very intelligent, somewhat terrifying. The Carthaginians use them in war. We're just showing you this one so you know they exist, and aren't surprised if we ever fight Carthaginians who bring them. It's so big, someone in the crowd said with awe. How does something that big exist? How does it eat enough? Where does it sleep? It eats constantly and sleeps standing up, Tarquinius replied. Nature is amazing, and sometimes creates things that seem impossible, but are merely improbable. The chariot races were the main event. Teams identified by colours, reds, whites, blues, greens, following Etruscan circus tradition. Professional drivers pushing horses to dangerous speeds around the oval track, taking the turns with skill that looked suicidal, and occasionally actually was when drivers misjudged and crashed spectacularly. The crowd went absolutely wild. Romans had seen horse racing before. Informal races at festivals, military cavalry demonstrations, casual competitions between young aristocrats, but never professional racing on a purpose-built track with skilled drivers competing for prizes and glory. Never with this level of speed and risk and dramatic crashes that sent drivers flying and horses careening into walls while crowds screamed, "This is incredible!" One spectator shouted to his neighbour over the crowd noise. "This is the best entertainment Rome has ever had. The blue team is winning." Another spectator yelled, "I bet on blues. I'm going to be rich. Blues are cheating." Someone else argued, "Reds should have won that last race. The referee is corrupt." Circus culture was born immediately. Team loyalties formed during single race day. Arguments erupted about which drivers were best. People bet money on outcomes. Vendors sold food at prices that made the food secondary to the experience. Everything that would characterize Roman circus attendance for centuries happened spontaneously during the Circus Maximus's inaugural games. Tarquinius watched from the royal viewing box with satisfaction. This was success, not just building the circus, but making it something Romans loved immediately. Something that would become Roman cultural institution, rather than foreign imposition they tolerated. "They love it," Tanaquil observed beside him. Women attended the circus, unlike some religious ceremonies where women were excluded. Circus games were public entertainment for everyone. You've given Rome something it didn't know it wanted until it had it. They wanted it, Tarquinius corrected. They just didn't know how to build it themselves. We provided Etruscan expertise to create Roman entertainment venue. Now it's theirs. They'll adopt it completely, make it Roman institution, eventually forget an Etruscan king built it. Does that bother you? Tanaquil asked. Building something that will be remembered as Roman rather than attributed to you specifically? No, Tarquinius said. watching a particularly skilled blue team driver take a turn at speeds that seemed impossible. I want Rome to be great. Whether they credit me or just absorb the improvements into Roman identity doesn't matter. I'm building legacy through what I create, not through personal credit. The circus will last, that's what matters. The games continued for 3 days. Different races, different exhibitions, different entertainment each day to keep crowds returning. By the third day, attendance was so high that the wooden seating was uncomfortably crowded, and people were already suggesting the circus needed expansion. We'll build stone seating eventually, Tarquinius promised during informal conversations with senators after the games concluded. Make it larger, more comfortable, more permanent. This is just beginning. The Circus Maximus will grow as Rome grows. The senators agreed enthusiastically. The circus had succeeded beyond their expectations. Romans loved it. Foreign visitors were impressed. The opening games had demonstrated Roman sophistication and cultural development in ways that mere military strength never could. You were right, one senator admitted to Tarquinius. Rome needed this. We didn't realize how much we needed impressive public architecture until we had it. What else can we build? That question, what else can we build, was exactly what Tarquinius had been hoping to hear, because the Circus Maximus was just the beginning. It was proof of concept. Demonstration that Etruscan expertise could create permanent monuments that made Rome impressive, rather than just powerful, opening the door to more ambitious construction that would transform Rome's visual character and cultural identity. The circus had succeeded. Rome wanted more, and Tarquinius had plans. So many plans. The city was about to become more impressive than anyone except Tanaquil and Tarquinius had imagined possible. Rome was about to discover that infrastructure could be glorious as well as functional, that public architecture could inspire awe as well as serving practical purpose, that Etruscan sophistication applied to Roman ambition could create something remarkable. The building had begun. The transformation was underway, and Rome, practical, powerful, newly circus-loving Rome, was ready to become magnificent. The circus's success gave Tarquinius something previous kings had lacked: popular enthusiasm. Romans loved their new entertainment venue. They attended games regularly. They developed passionate team loyalties. They argued about drivers and horses and race outcomes with the kind of intensity previously reserved for religious debates and military victories. The circus became Roman culture so quickly and thoroughly that within a year people struggled to remember what public life had been like before it existed, and crucially, Romans associated this improvement with their Etruscan king. Tarquinius had built the circus. Tarquinius had given them this gift. Tarquinius understood how to make Rome impressive, rather than just adequate. This popularity translated to political capital. When Tarquinius proposed his next initiative, the Senate was predisposed to approve because he'd proven competent at improving Rome. He'd earned trust through successful circus construction. Now he could spend that trust on something more controversial than entertainment architecture. Rome should expand, Tarquinius announced to the Senate in his 3rd year as king. The senators weren't surprised. Every Roman king except Numa had expanded territory. It's what kings did. They fought wars, conquered neighbours, increased Roman power. Tarquinius proposing military campaigns was expected, even overdue given that he'd spent his first years on administration and construction rather than warfare. Which direction? One senator asked practically. Rome was surrounded by potential targets. Latins to the south, Sabines to the northeast, Etruscans to the northwest. Each direction offered different strategic advantages and challenges. The Latin towns, Tarquinius said. Specifically, the cities that have been raiding our territory, treating Rome with insufficient respect, testing whether our new king is as militarily capable as previous kings, or whether Etruscan sophistication means Etruscan weakness. This was clever framing. Not I want to conquer neighbours for glory, but I'm defending Rome from disrespect and aggression. Not offensive war, but defensive necessity. Making military expansion sound like reasonable response to provocation rather than naked ambition. Which Latin towns specifically? Another senator asked. Appioliae, Tarquinius replied. They've been raiding farms near the border, taking cattle, killing shepherds. They think Rome under a foreign king won't respond effectively. We'll demonstrate they're wrong. We'll conquer Appioliae, incorporate their territory, make an example that discourages other Latin cities from similar testing. You're certain about Roman military capability? One senator asked carefully. It was the question everyone was thinking. Could an Etruscan king actually command Roman legions effectively? Military leadership required more than administrative competence, required understanding soldiers, tactics, the particular psychology of combat that either you comprehended instinctively or you didn't. I've studied Roman military organization extensively, Tarquinius replied. I've trained with the centuries, observed your tactics, learned your command structure. Etruscan military methods differ from Roman in some details, but the fundamentals are similar, and I'm not planning to revolutionize Roman warfare. I'm planning to use Roman methods that have worked successfully for 3 kings. I understand my limitations. I'll command, but I'll rely on experienced Roman officers for tactical execution. This was the right answer. Acknowledging expertise gaps while demonstrating he'd prepared seriously, not claiming to be military genius, just competent enough to lead campaigns without destroying Rome's army through incompetence. The Senate approved the campaign against Apiole. Some senators were enthusiastic, finally, military action after 3 years of administration and construction. Others were cautious. This would be the first test of whether Tarquinius could actually function as war leader, but consensus formed that Rome did need to respond to Latin raiding, and Tarquinius deserved opportunity to prove military capability. 2 months later, Rome marched against Apiole. The campaign was Rome's standard approach to small city conquest. March army to target city, demonstrate overwhelming force, offer terms that made surrender attractive compared to prolonged siege, accept surrender or fight if necessary, incorporate territory once resistance ended. Tarquinius commanded, but surrounded himself with experienced officers who'd served under Tullus and Ancus. He wasn't too proud to take advice, to ask questions about Roman military traditions, to let soldiers who knew warfare better than he did handle tactical details while he focused on overall strategy and maintaining army morale. The king listens, one veteran centurion told his unit. He doesn't pretend to know everything just because he's king. He asks our opinions about tactics, considers them seriously, makes decisions based on actual military knowledge rather than royal pride. That's refreshing. That's smart. The army appreciated having a king who respected their expertise. Tullus had been a brilliant military leader, but also arrogant and dismissive of anyone questioning his judgment. Ancus had been competent but uninspiring, good at logistics, less good at the dramatic leadership moments that made soldiers enthusiastic. Tarquinius was neither brilliant nor uninspiring. He was competent enough to command without disastrous mistakes, humble enough to take advice, and wealthy enough to ensure soldiers were well supplied and properly paid. We eat better under this king than we did under Ancus, one soldier observed during the march to Apiole. The supply wagons actually have food in them. Quality food. The king's Etruscan wealth is buying us decent rations instead of the usual military garbage. He also gave us that circus, another soldier added. When we get back from campaign, we can watch chariot races. That's worth serving under foreign king if foreign king treats us well. The siege of Apiola was brief and relatively bloodless. The city was small, poorly defended, clearly outmatched by Rome's army. Tarquinius offered generous terms: surrender immediately, acknowledge Roman authority, pay moderate tribute, keep local autonomy in daily affairs, refuse and face siege, conquest, and significantly worse terms after Rome won anyway. Apiola's leaders calculated the odds, recognized they couldn't win, surrendered within 3 days. Wise choice. Tarquinius told them during the formal surrender ceremony. Rome doesn't want to destroy you. We want to incorporate you peacefully. You'll keep your city, your homes, your basic governance. You just acknowledge Roman authority and contribute to Roman strength. That's better than being destroyed for pride. Apiola's territory was absorbed into Roman domain. The conquest was announced in Rome to general approval. Nothing spectacular, small city, brief campaign, bloodless victory, but successful. Proven that Tarquinius could lead military campaigns without embarrassing Rome. The Etruscan king can fight, Romans told each other. Not brilliant warrior like Tullus, but competent, smart enough to know his limits and use experienced officers, successful enough to expand Roman territory. That's adequate. Adequate was good. Adequate meant Rome could trust Tarquinius with more ambitious campaigns. Adequate meant the military capability concerns that had worried some senators were resolved positively. For Tarquinius, adequate was exactly what he'd aimed for. He wasn't trying to be legendary warrior, just needed to prove he could handle warfare competently enough that Rome's expansion could continue under his reign. The second campaign came a year later, against the Sabines. This was more ambitious. Not small Latin town, but established people who'd been Rome's enemies and allies, alternately for generations. The Sabines, who Romulus had fought and then integrated through strategic marriage, who'd given Rome its second king in Numa, who maintained complicated relationship with Rome that was neither fully hostile nor fully friendly. The Sabine town of Coletia has been interfering with Roman trade routes, Tarquinius explained to the Senate, charging excessive tolls, harassing merchants, treating Roman commerce with disrespect. We've sent diplomatic protests. They've ignored them. Military response is now appropriate. The Senate approved, though some senators noted this was bolder than conquering Apiole. The Sabinians could potentially unite against Roman aggression. This campaign risked turning manageable border dispute into larger conflict. I'm aware of the risks, Tarquinius acknowledged. I'm not planning full conquest of Sabine territory. That would indeed risk united opposition. I'm targeting Coletia specifically. Single city, limited campaign. Make clear that Rome won't tolerate trade interference without declaring war on all Sabines. Measured response that achieves goals without unnecessary escalation. The campaign against Coletia followed similar pattern to Apiole. March army, demonstrate strength, offer reasonable terms, accept surrender when it came. Coletia was better defended than Apiole, required longer siege, put up more resistance, but ultimately surrounded by Roman army and unable to get Sabine reinforcements in time. They surrendered on terms that let them keep autonomy while acknowledging Roman trade rights. 2 successful campaigns. 2 territorial additions. Proof that Tarquinius could expand Rome effectively without the constant warfare that had characterized Tullus's reign, or the pure defensiveness that had limited Ancus. The king fights smart wars, senators observed. Targeted campaigns against specific cities, achieves limited goals without overextending, knows when to accept surrender rather than pursuing total conquest. That's wise military leadership, not glorious, but sustainable. Rome's territory had grown noticeably under Tarquinius, not doubled like under Tullus. That kind of explosive expansion created problems that Tullus hadn't lived to address, but steady, measured growth that added resources and power without straining Roman capacity to govern conquered territories. The third campaign was more complex and revealed Tarquinius's strategic sophistication. Rather than conquering another Latin or Sabine city, Tarquinius proposed attacking the Etruscan city of Carrhae. The Senate was confused. "You're Etruscan," one senator pointed out. "From Tarquinia, Carrhae is also Etruscan. You want Rome to attack your own people? I want Rome to attack a city that's been raiding Roman allies and threatening trade routes." Tarquinius corrected. "That city happens to be Etruscan. My heritage doesn't excuse their aggression. Rome's interests come before Etruscan cultural loyalty. If Carrhae threatens Rome, we respond appropriately regardless of my personal origins." This was brilliant political positioning. By attacking an Etruscan city, Tarquinius demonstrated his loyalty was to Rome rather than to Etruria, proved he was Roman king, who happened to be Etruscan rather than Etruscan who happened to rule Rome, eliminated any lingering Senate concerns about divided loyalties. The campaign against Carrhae was the most difficult of Tarquinius's wars. Carrhae was larger, better defended, more professionally military than the Latin and Sabina towns Rome had previously conquered. They had walls that required serious siege engineering. They had organized military that fought effectively rather than just hoping Rome would go away. The siege lasted months, required sophisticated tactics, revealed Tarquinius's limitations as military commander. He was competent at strategy, less skilled at complex siege operations, dependent on his Roman officers for technical expertise he lacked. The king is struggling. Some soldiers observed during the extended siege. He knows what he wants to achieve, but isn't always sure how to achieve it. Fortunately, the centurions know siege warfare and can handle the actual operations while the king manages overall campaign. This wasn't criticism, just observation. The soldiers respected that Tarquinius knew his limits, delegated appropriately, and didn't pretend expertise he didn't have. Better to have king who admitted weaknesses and compensated for them, than king who pretended competence and made disastrous decisions through arrogance. Kentra eventually fell. Not through brilliant military action, but through patience and proper siege techniques. Once the walls were breached, once food supplies ran low, once continuing resistance became pointless, Kentri surrendered on terms that acknowledged Roman dominance while allowing them to maintain some independence as Roman client city. "We've defeated an Etruscan city," Tarquinius announced to Rome after the victory. "Proof that Rome is strong enough to challenge Etruscan power. Proof that I am Roman king, who serves Roman interests without favoritism toward my heritage. Carrhae threatened our allies. We responded. They submitted. Rome is stronger for it." The Senate applauded. Enthusiastically this time. Not just politely. Attacking Cara had been risky, could have gone badly, could have united other Etruscan cities against Rome. But Tarquinius had calculated correctly that Cara was isolated enough, unpopular enough with other Etruscan cities, that Rome could conquer them without triggering wider conflict. The king is strategically brilliant, senators told each other. Not just militarily competent, but politically sophisticated. He attacked Cari knowing it would prove his Roman loyalty, while also knowing other Etruscan cities wouldn't object strongly enough to matter. That's impressive thinking. By his 7th year as king, Tarquinius had successfully expanded Roman territory through 3 deliberate campaigns. Not constant warfare like Tullus, not defensive limitation like Ancrus, measured expansion that added power and resources while proving military capability without overextending. More importantly, he'd proven himself fully Roman despite Etruscan origins. The attack on Carla had eliminated any lingering questions about loyalty. Romans trusted him now, not just as competent administrator or talented builder, but as king who would defend Roman interests against anyone, including his own cultural people. He's more Roman than some Romans, one senator joked. Shows up actual Romans in his commitment to expanding our power. The military success gave Tarquinius political capital for his next ambitious project. He'd built the Circus, demonstrated administrative competence, and expanded Roman territory successfully. Now he could propose something even more expensive and transformative than entertainment architecture. Now he could start talking about proper temples. Rome had temples, of course. Rome had temples. Romans were intensely religious. Every significant god had dedicated sacred space, but Roman temples were adequate, functional, stone structures that served purpose without being particularly impressive architecturally. Nothing like Etruscan temples. Nothing like Greek temples that both Etruscans and Romans knew about but couldn't quite replicate. Nothing that made foreign visitors look at Roman religious architecture and think, this is an impressive civilization. Tarquinius wanted to change that. Wanted to build temples worthy of Rome's growing power. Wanted to apply Etruscan architectural sophistication to Roman religious life, the same way he'd applied it to entertainment with the circus. Rome needs a great temple to Jupiter, Tarquinius proposed during a Senate session after returning from the Caere campaign. Jupiter is king of the gods. Rome is becoming a major power. Our greatest god deserves our greatest building. A temple so impressive that everyone who sees it understands Rome's strength and sophistication. This will be expensive, one senator said predictably. The constant refrain whenever Tarquinius proposed building anything. I'll fund it, Tarquinius replied, equally predictably. Mostly. This will be larger than the circus, more elaborate, more expensive. But I have wealth from successful campaigns, tribute from conquered cities, confiscated resources from Cares. I'll spend it on permanent improvements to Rome, rather than just enriching myself. The temple will be mine to Rome, my legacy beyond military victories, the Senate considered. A great temple to Jupiter was hard to argue against, who opposed honoring the king of the gods more impressively. And Tarquinius had proven capable of completing ambitious building projects. The circus worked, presumably he could build temples too. Where would this temple be? Someone asked. The Capitoline Hill, Tarquinius said. Rome's sacred center, where Romulus took the auspices, where Rome's religious heart resides. The highest point, visible from everywhere in the city. Perfect location for Rome's greatest temple. That's ambitious, another senator observed. The Capitoline is sacred ground. Building there requires extensive religious preparation. Multiple ceremonies, extended purifications, constant divine consultation to ensure the gods approve. I know, Tarquinius said. That's why I'm proposing it now, in my 7th year, after proving competence through multiple successful projects. I'm not rushing into this. I'm planning carefully. We'll do it properly. Every religious requirement satisfied. Every ceremony performed. The gods will approve because we'll do everything correctly. The debate lasted weeks. But eventually, consensus formed. Rome could afford to build an impressive temple. Jupiter deserved impressive temple. Tarquinius had proven capable of ambitious construction. The Capitoline location was appropriate. The Senate approved the Jupiter temple project. Tarquinius smiled. This would be his masterpiece. The circus had been impressive. The temple would be magnificent. The building that defined Rome's visual identity for centuries, that announced Rome's arrival as Mediterranean power worthy of respect. He'd built entertainment. He'd proven military competence. Now he'd create religious grandeur, piece by piece, project by project. Tarquinius was transforming Rome from functional city-state into impressive civilization, and Rome wealthy from conquests, confident from success, trusting its Etruscan king was letting him do it. The wars had succeeded, the expansion had worked, the building could continue, Rome was becoming glorious. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter best and greatest, began with religious ceremonies, so elaborate that they took longer than some of Tarquinius's military campaigns. The Capitoline Hill was sacred ground, had been sacred since Romulus's time, possibly before. Building there required divine permission, obtained through extensive auguries, sacrifices, purifications, consultations with every relevant priesthood, and probably a few ceremonies that existed mainly to make sure nobody could claim proper procedures hadn't been followed. We've been performing religious preparations for 3 months. One priest complained to another during the 47th purification ceremony. At this rate, the auguries will take longer than the actual construction. Better excessive ceremony than insufficient, his companion replied. Remember what happened to Tullus when he got casual about divine respect? Jupiter takes proper procedure seriously. We're building his temple. We should probably be thorough. The auguries were consulted repeatedly. Birds were observed. Chickens were questioned extensively about their opinions. Or at least their eating habits were interpreted as opinions. Lightning was watched for. Thunder was analyzed. Every possible sign was examined to ensure Jupiter approved of temple construction on his sacred hill. The gods appeared satisfied. Or at least they didn't send obvious disapproval through lightning strikes or ill-omened bird behavior. In Roman religious logic, divine silence meant divine approval, which was convenient for people wanting to build things. Jupiter has blessed the temple project. The augurs announced after months of careful observation, construction may proceed with divine sanction. Tarquinius commissioned Etruscan architects, the best available, imported specifically for this project from cities throughout Etruria. This would be Rome's most important building. It needed to be perfect, needed to combine Etruscan architectural sophistication with Roman religious requirements in ways that impressed everyone who saw it. The design was ambitious, not just large, enormous. 3 chambers inside for Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Rome's most important gods, housed together in unprecedented architectural statement about divine authority and Roman power. This will be the largest temple in Italy when completed, the lead architect explained to Tarquinius while reviewing the plans. Larger than any Etruscan temple, larger than Greek temples in southern Italy. A building that defines Rome's architectural identity and announces your civilization's importance to everyone who sees it. How long will it take? Tarquinius asked. Longer than your reign? Almost certainly, the architect replied honestly. This is multi-generation project. You'll start it, make significant progress. Your successors will continue. Eventually, maybe 30 years from now, maybe 40, it will be completed, but you'll be remembered as the king who began Rome's greatest building. Tarquinius accepted this. He was building legacy, not immediate monument. The temple would outlast him. That was the point. Kings died, buildings remained. Better to start something magnificent that would be finished by others than to build something mediocre that could be completed quickly. The foundation work began in Tarquinius's 9th year as king. The Capitoline Hill required extensive preparation. Not just clearing the existing structures, small shrines, houses, various buildings that had accumulated over Rome's first generations, but creating solid foundation that could support the massive weight of the temple Tarquinius planned. We're essentially rebuilding the entire hilltop. One engineer explained to curious Romans who came to watch the foundation work. Leveling it properly, creating artificial platform, building stone base that will last centuries. This isn't temporary construction. This is permanent. This foundation will support the temple for as long as Rome exists. The foundation work was predictably expensive. More expensive than Tarquinius had initially estimated. Building projects always cost more than planned. That was universal law of construction that transcended culture and era. The foundation alone consumed significant portion of the budget Tarquinius had allocated for the entire temple. This is costing more than expected, Tarquinius admitted to Tanaquil during one of their evening conversations about project finances. I'm spending personal wealth faster than planned. The temple will bankrupt me if I'm not careful. So get more money. Tanaquil suggested practically. You're king. Kings have options for acquiring wealth beyond personal savings. Increase tribute from conquered cities. Tax Roman citizens more carefully with justification about funding religious construction. Confiscate property from criminals with particularly valuable estates. You have authority, use it strategically. It was pragmatic advice. Also the beginning of something problematic, using royal authority to fund personal projects, blurring the line between public treasury and private wealth, creating precedent that kings could take resources from citizens for ambitious goals. But Tarquinius needed funding. The temple couldn't be left half-finished. That would be embarrassing, impious, wasteful of everything already spent. Better to use questionable funding methods than to abandon Jupiter's temple incomplete. He increased tribute from conquered cities, not excessively enough to fund construction without provoking rebellion, calibrated carefully to maximize revenue without maximizing resentment. He imposed special taxes on wealthy Romans, framed as voluntary contributions to sacred construction, but structured so that not contributing looked impious and socially unacceptable. You're supporting Jupiter's temple. You're honoring Rome's greatest god. Everyone who can afford to contribute should participate in this sacred project. Wealthy Romans contributed, some enthusiastically because they genuinely wanted impressive Jupiter temple, others reluctantly because refusing seemed politically and religiously dangerous. The funding worked. Construction continued. The foundation was completed after 2 years of intensive work. The actual temple structure began rising on the artificial platform that now topped the Capitoline Hill, and Romans began feeling the cost. Not just financially, though the special taxes were unpopular, and the increased tribute created grumbling in conquered cities, but in precedent, Tarquinius was demonstrating that kings could extract significant resources from citizens and subjects for ambitious projects, could blur boundaries between public good and royal vision, could use authority to fund personal legacy, even when personal legacy served public purposes. The king is getting expensive, some Romans muttered. Not just the temple, but also constant projects. The circus, various public works, everything costs money, Roman money, our money, taken through taxes we can't refuse without looking impious. Others defended Tarquinius. He's building Rome's greatness. The circus provides entertainment. The temple will honor Jupiter properly. The public works improve the city. You can't have impressive civilization without paying for it. The king is investing in permanent improvements rather than just spending lavishly on personal luxury. Both perspectives were valid. Tarquinius was building impressive things. He was also spending enormous amounts of money and setting precedents about royal authority over resources that would create problems later. Good intentions didn't eliminate problematic methods. The temple construction revealed another issue. Labor. Building something as massive as the Jupiter temple required enormous workforce. Hundreds of laborers working simultaneously on different aspects. Quarrying stone, transporting materials, cutting blocks to precise specifications, lifting them into place, carving decorations, preparing the roof structures, creating the elaborate terracotta ornamentation that would make the temple visually magnificent. Initially, Tarquinius used paid labor, Roman citizens and freed workers hired at fair wages. This was expensive, but avoided the political problems that would come from forcing citizens to work. But as costs escalated, as funding became more constrained, as the project demanded more workers than could be hired economically, Tarquinius made decision that would define his legacy negatively. He began using forced labor, not Roman citizens. That would have been politically impossible, would have outraged the Senate, and probably triggered revolt. But conquered peoples from the Latin and Sabine cities, Rome had absorbed. People who were subjects but not full citizens, who had limited rights and limited ability to refuse royal demands. The conquered peoples will provide labor for public works, Tarquinius announced. Not asking, stating, not voluntary contribution, requirement. Rome has absorbed their cities, given them protection and order. They'll contribute to Roman greatness through service on construction projects. The Senate was uncomfortable. This was harsher than how Rome traditionally treated conquered peoples. Ancus had integrated them gently, offering citizenship, making them want to be Roman. Tarquinius was using them as labor resource, making them feel conquered rather than integrated. This risks resentment, one senator warned. These people were becoming Roman. Now we're treating them as subjects rather than future citizens. That creates problems. It's temporary, Tarquinius replied, until the temple is completed. Then they'll be integrated normally. But currently, we need their labor and can't afford to pay market wages for this scale of workforce. Using conquered peoples for public works is pragmatic. It's also what tyrants do. Another senator said quietly. Force subjects to build monuments. Use authority to compel labor without consent. Tarquinius didn't have good answer to that. It was what he was doing. He was compelling labor from conquered peoples to build his vision of Roman greatness. It was tyrannical, even if the goal was supposedly public benefit. The forced labor began. Hundreds of Latin and Sabine workers brought to Rome, housed in temporary camps near the Capitol and put to work on the temple construction under Roman overseers who treated them as conscripts rather than employees. The workers resented it. Obviously, they'd been conquered, absorbed into Rome, told they'd be integrated as citizens, then immediately put to forced labor building monuments while Romans watched and gave orders. It created exactly the resentment the senator had warned about. "We're slaves," the workers muttered among themselves. "Not citizens, not even respected subjects, just labor. Building Roman monuments with our sweat while Romans tell us we should be grateful for the opportunity to serve Roman greatness." "The king is Etruscan," one Latin worker observed bitterly. "Foreign, we're Latin, native to this region, yet somehow the foreigner rules and we labor. That's wrong, that's backwards." The resentment spread beyond construction sites. Latin and Sabine communities that Rome had conquered heard about forced labor, about people being taken from families to work on Roman projects, about harsh treatment and inadequate compensation. Communities that had been accepting Roman rule under Ancus's integration approach began reconsidering that acceptance. Rome under the Etruscan king is different. Latin leaders told each other, harsher, more exploitative. We should consider whether Roman rule serves our interests anymore. Seeds were being planted. Not immediate rebellion. Rome was still too strong militarily for conquered cities to risk open revolt. But long-term resentment, the kind that would fester and wait for opportunity, that would create problems for whoever came after Tarquinius, but those were future problems. Currently, the temple was being built. Progress was visible. The structure was rising on the Capitoline Hill, becoming impressive reality rather than just ambitious plan. By Tarquinius's 15th year as king, the Jupiter temple was perhaps half complete. Foundation done, walls rising, roof structure beginning, still years from completion, but substantial enough that Romans could see what it would become, could understand the scale and ambition, could recognize this would indeed be Rome's greatest building. "It's magnificent," Romans told each other, looking up at the partially completed temple dominating the Capitoline. "It makes Rome look like a real Mediterranean power, like we belong among great civilizations rather than just being a successful village state that's good at warfare." The circus was popular. The temple was impressive. The conquered territories expanded Roman power. Under Tarquinius, Rome had transformed from Ancus's functional city into something more ambitious and sophisticated. But the transformation had costs. Financial burden on Romans, forced labor from conquered peoples, precedents about royal authority over resources and subjects, methods that worked in short term but created problems in long term. Tarquinius was building Rome's greatness. He was also building Rome's resentments, creating the conditions that would eventually make monarchy problematic, setting patterns of royal behavior that would, in later kings, become tyrannical rather than merely ambitious. The king has made Rome impressive, senators acknowledged in their private conversations, but also expensive, and somewhat oppressive to conquered peoples. We're grateful for what he's built. We're also concerned about what precedents he's established. Can we afford to continue this? Someone asked. Constant ambitious projects, endless construction, rising costs, exploitation of subjects. Where does this lead? Probably to more greatness. Someone else replied. Also probably to eventual problems. But problems are future concerns. Currently we have impressive circus and nearly completed magnificent temple. That seems worth some costs. Rome under Tarquinius had become glorious. More impressive than under any previous king. More culturally sophisticated. More architecturally magnificent. More capable of impressing foreign visitors and intimidating neighbors. But glory had price. Costs that Romans were beginning to feel. Resentments that conquered peoples were beginning to harbor. Precedents that future kings would expand beyond what Tarquinius intended. The seeds of monarchy's end were being planted, even as monarchy reached its height of achievement. But that was subtle, long-term, not obvious yet. What was obvious was that Rome had circus and temple and expanded territory and cultural sophistication and architectural magnificence that previous generations couldn't have imagined. What was obvious was that Tarquinius, despite being foreign, despite being Etruscan, had given Rome achievements worthy of remembering. What wasn't obvious yet wouldn't become obvious for another generation. was that making Rome great through ambitious projects and forced labor and flexible interpretation of royal authority would eventually teach Romans that maybe kings weren't necessary, that maybe republican government without monarchy might be preferable to monarchy that built impressive things through questionable methods. But that realization was years away. Multiple kings away. Not Tarquinius's problem. Currently, the temple rose, the city improved. Rome became glorious. And if glory required sacrifice, financial sacrifice from Roman citizens, labor sacrifice from conquered peoples, well, that seemed manageable price for greatness. The building continued. The transformation proceeded. Rome under Tarquinius became the city it would be remembered as for centuries. Powerful, impressive, sophisticated, worthy of respect. One temple project at a time. One forced labor conscription at a time. One precedent-setting use of royal authority at a time. Building glory. Creating problems. Becoming great and problematic simultaneously. That was the legacy of Tarquinius Priscus, the Etruscan king, who made Rome magnificent and taught Romans that magnificence had costs they weren't entirely comfortable paying. Tarquinius ruled for 38 years, long enough to build monuments, long enough to make enemies, long enough that people who'd been children when he arrived with an eagle omen were now adults with their own ambitions and grievances. The final years of his reign were marked by continued construction, the Jupiter Temple progressing slowly toward completion, various smaller public works, constant improvement of Rome's visual character, and also by the particular weariness that came with long rule. "I'm getting old," Tarquinius admitted to Tanaquil during one of their evening conversations. They were perhaps 65 now, ancient by Roman standards, still sharp-minded but physically declining in the obvious ways that age created. "You're still capable," Tanaquil replied. "Still building. Still governing effectively. Old doesn't mean finished. Old means making enemies you don't even realize are enemies." Tarquinius said, "I've ruled for 38 years. That's longer than most Romans have been alive. I've made decisions that angered people, imposed taxes that created resentment, used forced labor that generated hatred among conquered peoples. Even my successes create enemies. Every impressive building reminds certain people that a foreign king accomplished what Roman kings didn't." "You've also made Rome great," Tanaquil pointed out. "The circus, the temple, expanded territory, cultural sophistication. Rome is more impressive now than when we arrived. That's success. Success that breeds resentment," Tarquinius corrected. "Some Romans love what I've built. Others resent what it cost. Some conquered peoples appreciate integration. Others hate being used as labor. Success and resentment coexist. I'm aware of both." He was becoming philosophical in his old age, aware that his reign had been mixed. Genuine achievements combined with problematic methods. Glory built partially on exploitation. Magnificence funded through unpopular extraction of resources. He'd done what he'd intended when arriving at Rome's gates with an eagle omen and ambitious wife. He'd become king. He'd transformed Rome. He'd built legacy that would outlast him through permanent monuments and expanded territory. But he'd also alienated people, created enemies, set precedents that future kings might abuse beyond his intentions, made monarchy more powerful, and also paradoxically more problematic by demonstrating what monarchy could achieve through flexible interpretation of royal authority. "Do you regret it?" Tanaquil asked. "The methods, the costs, the resentments?" "No," Tarquinius said after thinking. "I did what Rome needed, made hard choices, used available authority to accomplish goals that required resources and labor Rome wouldn't have provided voluntarily. I built Rome's greatness through methods that weren't always popular but were effective. No regrets about effectiveness. Some awareness that effectiveness came with costs. It was honest self-assessment. Not denial about problems, not pretending he'd been perfect king. Just acknowledgement that building greatness required choices that created complications. Those complications were about to manifest violently. Ancus Marcius's sons had been waiting 38 years. When Tarquinius became king, they'd been young men in their 20s, sons of the previous king, presumably expecting that one of them would succeed their father through Rome's election process that favoured continuity and familial connection. Instead, Rome had chosen an Etruscan foreigner, had given kingship to someone with no Roman ancestry, no traditional claim, nothing but wealth and divine omen and political sophistication that had outmaneuvered their legitimate expectations. They'd been angry then, resentful, convinced that Rome had made terrible mistake choosing foreign king, over sons of successful Roman king, but they'd been patient, waited, watched, hoped Tarquinius would fail spectacularly enough that Rome would regret its choice and turn to them as obvious replacements. Tarquinius hadn't failed, had succeeded extensively. Built Circus, expanded territory, began magnificent temple, transformed Rome into impressive civilization, made himself popular through achievements that overshadowed anything Ancus had accomplished. The son's resentment had grown over decades, festered, became permanent hatred of man who'd taken what they believed was rightfully theirs. Not rational grievance. Tarquinius had won legitimate election, had governed successfully, had earned his position, but ancient irrational resentment of being passed over for foreigner. He's ruled for 38 years. One son, Lucius Marcius, said to the other during one of their frequent conversations about injustice and missed opportunities. 38 years that should have been ours. We're old men now. We've spent our entire adult lives watching Etruscan foreigner rule Rome while we were ignored. He'll die eventually. The other son, Gaius Marcius, replied. He's old. Probably 5 years left at most. When he dies, Rome will choose new king. We can try again then. And lose again, Lucius said bitterly. Because by then everyone will have forgotten our father. Everyone will remember Tarquinius instead. The circus, the temple, the expansion. Roman children now think Etruscan sophistication built Rome's greatness. They don't remember that Roman kings founded this city, that our father ruled competently before the foreigner arrived. So what do you suggest? Gaius asked. We can't overthrow him. He's popular. The Senate supports him. The army respects him. What options do we have besides waiting for natural death? Lucius looked at his brother with the expression of someone who'd been thinking about this for years, decades, since the day Tarquinius had been elected instead of them. We accelerate natural death, Lucius said quietly. We kill him. Make it look like accident or random violence. Create succession crisis. Position ourselves to be chosen in the chaos that follows. That's assassination, Gaius said, though not rejecting the idea, just stating it clearly. Murder of the king. If we're caught, we die. If we succeed but are discovered later, we die. This is extremely dangerous. We're old men who've spent our lives resenting foreigner who took our rightful position, Lucius replied. What do we have to lose? Another 5 years of watching him rule successfully? Another 5 years of being forgotten by Romans who remember circus and temple, but not our father's bridge. I'd rather risk death attempting to reclaim what should have been ours than die having never tried. Gaius considered. His brother was right. They had nothing to lose, no children to inherit shame if assassination failed. Neither brother had married, had been too consumed with resentment to build normal lives. No legacy except being sons of king, whose achievements were overshadowed by his successor. Nothing except decades of resentment and opportunity to act on it. How? Gaius asked. He visits construction sites regularly, Lucius said. He'd been planning this. Goes to check temple progress, talks with workers, shows personal attention to projects. There's a moment every visit when he's relatively unguarded. Surrounded by workers, yes, but not heavily protected. We disguise ourselves as labourers, get close, strike quickly, escape in the confusion. That's remarkably specific, Gaius observed. You've been planning this. For years, Lucius admitted, waiting for right opportunity. Waiting to see if I'd actually commit to it rather than just fantasizing. I'm old now, Tarquinius is old. If we're going to act, it's now, no more waiting. They planned carefully. Not rushing, not acting impulsively, but preparing methodically for assassination that would either succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically with no middle outcome. The assassination happened on an ordinary afternoon in Tarquinius's 38th year as king. He'd gone to the Capitoline Hill to check temple progress, routine visit. Happened weekly, nothing special or unusual. Some guards accompanied him, but not excessive security. He was elderly king, checking construction site, not military commander expecting attack. The temple was nearly complete now. Another few years would finish it. Maybe. Or maybe 10 years. Construction estimates were notoriously unreliable, but substantial enough to be impressive, to show what it would become, to demonstrate Roman architectural ambition. Tarquinius walked among the workers, asking questions about progress, examining carved details, discussing technical challenges with the overseers, engaged, interested, genuinely caring about this building that would be his primary legacy. The sons of Ancus approached, dressed as labourers. Not obviously armed weapons would have been noticed by guards, just carrying tools that labourers normally carried. Tools that could be weapons if used violently. They got close. closer than armed men would have been allowed. Close enough that when they struck effectively. Tarquinius died quickly. At least there was that mercy. Struck from behind, didn't see it coming, didn't suffer prolonged death. Just sudden violence, an immediate end to 38 years of rule. The construction site erupted in chaos. Workers screaming, guards rushing toward the king's fallen body, the assassins trying to escape through crowds of panicking laborers. They didn't escape. Guards caught them within minutes. Violence had been too public, too many witnesses, too obviously deliberate murder rather than accident. Why? One guard demanded, holding Lucius Marcius while others secured his brother. Why kill the king? What did you hope to achieve? Reclaiming what was stolen, Lucius replied. Not ashamed, not regretful, just stating fact as he understood it. He took our father's position, took what should have been ours. We took it back. By killing him? The guard said incredulously. That doesn't make you king. That just makes you murderers. It creates opportunity, Lucius said. Succession crisis. Rome needs new king. We're sons of previous king. Rome might choose us now that the foreigner is dead. The guard looked at him with mixture of contempt and pity. Rome will execute you for regicide. You've guaranteed you'll never be king. You've accomplished nothing except murder. He was right. The sons of Ancus had waited 38 years, planned carefully, committed assassination successfully, and achieved absolutely nothing except ensuring their own deaths and giving Tarquinius martyrdom that would make his legacy more positive than it might have been otherwise. They were executed 3 days later, publicly, as warning about consequences of killing kings, and as demonstration that Rome wouldn't tolerate regicide, regardless of assassins' claimed grievances. The sons of Ancus murdered King Tarquinius, the announcement said. Motivated by resentment and entitlement, they have been executed for their crime. Rome mourns its king and will choose successor through proper means rather than rewarding assassins' violence. Tarquinius's funeral was elaborate. Not quite deification like Romulus. Romans had become more skeptical about kings becoming gods after Romulus's mysterious disappearance and suspicions of Senate murder, but respectful, acknowledging his achievements while not ignoring his complications. King Tarquinius Priscus ruled Rome for 38 years. The funeral oration stated, "He built our circus, giving Romans entertainment and demonstrating our cultural sophistication. He began the great temple to Jupiter that will, when completed, announce Rome's greatness to all who see it. He expanded our territory through smart warfare and strategic conquest. He brought Etruscan expertise that transformed Rome from functional city into impressive civilization. He also ruled with heavy hand at times, imposed taxes that burdened citizens, used forced labor from conquered peoples, set precedents about royal authority that may create problems for future generations. He was not perfect king, but he was effective king. Rome is stronger, wealthier, more impressive for his reign. He proved that foreign king could serve Roman interests faithfully, that Etruscan heritage didn't prevent Roman loyalty, that capability and divine blessing mattered more than ancestry. He changed what Romans thought possible for their city, made us ambitious for greatness beyond just military power. May the gods receive him favorably. May his temple be completed as monument to his vision. May Rome remember both his achievements and his costs. May future kings learn from both his successes and his mistakes." It was honest eulogy, not hagiography, not condemnation, just acknowledgement of complex legacy from long, consequential reign. Tanaquil attended the funeral but didn't speak publicly. Women didn't deliver funeral orations, and also she was grieving privately rather than publicly. Mourning husband she'd been married to for 50 years, partner in ambition and achievement, and the transformation of Rome. After the funeral, after the immediate chaos of assassination and execution and public mourning, Rome faced succession question again. Who would be fifth king? How would Rome choose? What qualities mattered now that Tarquinius had demonstrated foreign kings could rule successfully, and also that successful rule created complications? The answer surprised everyone, including probably Tanaquil, though she adapted quickly because Tanaquil always adapted quickly to political realities. The Senate chose Servius Tullius, not a foreign merchant, not a Roman aristocrat, but man of uncertain origin, possibly slave-born, possibly divine parentage depending on which story you believed. Definitely unusual background for kingship, but he'd been Tarquinius's son-in-law, had served as advisor and regent during Tarquinius's final years, had military experience, had Senate support, had, crucially, Tanaquil's support, because she wanted continuity, and Servius provided that. Servius Tullius will be Rome's 6th king, the announcement declared. May he rule wisely and continue Rome's greatness. Rome transitioned smoothly from one king to next. No crisis, no chaos, just orderly succession, despite assassination that could have destabilized everything. Tarquinius would have approved. He'd built institutions and relationships strong enough to survive his death. That was success beyond just monuments and territories. That was creating sustainable governance that didn't depend on any individual king. Years passed, decades. The Jupiter Temple was completed under Servius's reign. Finally, after a total of perhaps 40 years of construction spread across 2 kings, it stood exactly as magnificent as Tarquinius had envisioned. Largest temple in Italy, visible from everywhere in Rome, announcing Roman power and sophistication to all who saw it. The Circus Maximus continued operating, was expanded and improved over generations, became fundamental part of Roman culture. Exactly as Tarquinius had intended, Romans couldn't imagine life without circus games now. Couldn't remember what public entertainment had been before Etruscan king built them permanent venue. The conquered territories remained Roman, were integrated slowly over generations, became simply Roman rather than conquered and resented. The forced labor resentments faded as people who remembered them died and were replaced by children who'd only known Roman rule. Tarquinius's legacy solidified. Not purely positive. Historians would note his use of forced labor, his heavy taxation, his precedent-setting expansion of royal authority, but predominantly positive. Remembered as king who'd made Rome impressive, who'd transformed city-state into civilization, who'd proven foreign expertise could serve Roman interests. Tarquinius Priscus built Rome's greatness, Romans told their children, explaining the circus and the temple and the expansion. He was Etruscan but became Roman, brought sophistication we lacked, made Rome worthy of being called great rather than just powerful. Some remembered complications. He used forced labor, imposed heavy taxes, set precedents about royal authority that later kings abused. Not perfect, effective but costly. Both versions were true. Tarquinius had been great king and problematic king simultaneously, had achieved impressive things through questionable methods, had built Rome's glory while planting seeds of problems that would eventually contribute to monarchy's end. That was nuanced legacy, not simple heroism, not pure villainy, just complex human achievement, ambition and capability, creating good outcomes through methods that had mixed effects and long-term consequences. The eagle omen had been correct. Jupiter had blessed Tarquinius for high office. The gods had approved his transformation of Rome from functional city into magnificent civilization. But divine blessing didn't mean perfect outcomes, didn't mean every choice was wise or every method was justified, just meant the gods thought Rome needed what Tarquinius offered, even knowing the costs, even understanding the complications. The Etruscan king had given Rome greatness. Whether that greatness was worth its price remained debatable. But the greatness itself, the circus, the temple, the expanded territory, the cultural sophistication, was undeniable. Tarquinius Priscus, the foreign king who made Rome magnificent, the ambitious merchant with an eagle blessing, who proved capability mattered more than ancestry, the builder whose monuments outlasted his memory, whose methods created problems even while achieving goals, whose reign demonstrated that success and complication coexisted in leadership. Not simple story, but true story. The kind of nuanced, complex legacy that defined actual history rather than legend. The eagle had spoken. Rome had listened. Tarquinius had ruled. Rome had been transformed. And centuries later, when Rome was empire rather than kingdom, when the city Tarquinius had made magnificent, had conquered the Mediterranean, when the temple he'd started had been rebuilt multiple times, and the circus he'd built had been expanded beyond recognition, Romans still remembered the Etruscan king who'd arrived with an omen and left with monuments, who'd proved foreign expertise could serve Roman greatness, who'd built glory that lasted centuries even though the man himself had been murdered by resentful sons of a king whose achievements were overshadowed by his successor's vision. Not perfect king, not simple hero, just effective leader who made ambitious choices with mixed consequences and lasting impact. Tarquinius Priscus, the bridge between Rome's early simplicity and later magnificence. The king who taught Rome that it could be great as well as powerful. His monument stood, his legacy endured, his complications were remembered alongside his achievements. That was success, measured honestly. That was legacy worth the costs. Rome remembered. The circus still operated. the temple still dominated the Capitolin, and somewhere in Roman memory, an eagle circled, carrying a cap toward heaven, blessing a foreign merchant for kingship that would transform a city. The blessing had been accurate. The transformation had happened. The costs had been real, but the achievements were lasting. Balance, complexity, success and complication together. The story of Tarquinius Priscus, the Etruscan king, complete. Thank you for spending these hours with Tarquinius Priscus, the Etruscan king who made Rome magnificent. If you enjoyed this journey through Roman history, please subscribe for new episodes soon. We're building Rome's story king by king, from mythological founding through the Seven Kings and beyond. Next episode, Servius Tullius, Rome's mysterious sixth king, born of uncertain origins, possibly slave, possibly divine, who will reform Rome's constitution, conduct the first census, and rule for 44 years before meeting a violent end that mirrors his predecessor's fate. Rate and review if you're inclined. It helps others discover these long-form history stories. Share with anyone who loves ancient history or needs something substantial for sleep or study. Until next time, rest well. The circus stands. The temple rises. Rome continues its transformation. See you soon.